Hello everyone and welcome back to Shadow Man Stories. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now, let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Marcus Ironwood, and I've been a park ranger in Alaska for 14 years. In all that time, I've found over 100 lost souls in the wilderness. Some were hurt, some were scared, but I always brought them home. I used to think my grandmother's old stories were just tales to keep kids from wandering off alone. Stories about things that live in the dark corners of Alaska, things that steal people away. I was wrong about that. Dead wrong. It was February 1975, the coldest winter I'd ever seen. The temperature hit 40 below, and we only got about 4 hours of dim light each day. The rest was just darkness pressing down on you like a heavy blanket. Wonder Lake was frozen solid, thick enough to drive a truck on. You could see Denali Mountain in the distance when the weather was clear. 20,000 feet of ice and rock watching over everything. I was stationed at Wonder Lake, about 200 miles from Anchorage. When the aurora lights got strong, our radios would go crazy. Sometimes you couldn't talk to anyone for hours. It was the kind of place where you really felt alone in the world. My grandmother used to tell me stories about the Kushtaka. She said they were like men, but not men. They lived in the water and could change their shape to look like people you knew. The old stories said they would call to fishermen from the water, looking just like a friend or family member. When the fishermen got close, the Kushtaka would pull them down and steal their souls. I never believed those stories. I figured when people got too cold, their minds started playing tricks on them, made them see things that weren't there. I thought hypothermia caused hallucinations. After what happened in February 75, I know better now. The call came in on a Tuesday morning. A research team from the University of Alaska had gone missing near Wonder Lake. 4 people, 2 men and 2 women, all smart folks studying the weather patterns. Their last radio contact was 3 days ago. They were supposed to check in every 12 hours. But we hadn't heard anything since. The weather had been brutal. 3 straight days of blizzard that would freeze you solid in minutes if you got caught outside. But when Tuesday morning came, the wind stopped. The air was so still it felt wrong, like the whole world was holding its breath. I called my partner Jenkins to get ready for a search. Tom Jenkins had been doing this job for 25 years. He had a wife and 3 kids back in Anchorage. If anyone could help me find those missing people, it was him. We packed our emergency gear, extra flares, warm sleeping bags, food for 3 days, and our best cold weather clothes. The plan was simple. Head out to where the research team had set up their camp, look for signs, and bring them home. In all my years as a ranger, it had never been more complicated than that. People got lost, you found them, you brought them back. That's how it worked. I should have paid attention to how quiet everything was that morning. No wind, no birds, no sound from the small animals that usually lived around the lake. Even the ice wasn't making its normal cracking sounds. It was like something had scared away every living thing for miles around. But I didn't think much about it then. I just wanted to find those 4 people and get them somewhere warm. We found their camp just after noon, about 5 miles from the lake shore. What we saw there made us both stop in our tracks. The camp was perfect, too perfect. 4 tents set up in a perfect square. Equipment laid out in neat lines. The fire pit had logs stacked like someone had just finished arranging them. Everything looked like a picture from a camping magazine. "That's not right," Jenkins said, pulling off his face mask. His breath made white clouds in the cold air. "We just had 3 days of blizzard. This stuff should be buried under snow or blown all over the place." He was right. The wind had been strong enough to knock down trees, but these tents looked like they'd been set up 5 minutes ago. No snow on them, no ice hanging from the edges. The equipment was arranged in perfect rows, like someone had used a ruler. I checked inside the tents with my flashlight. Sleeping bags rolled up tight. Personal items arranged neat and tidy. Nobody had slept in those bags. Nobody had used any of that gear. Maybe they packed up before the storm hit, I suggested. But even as I said it, I knew it didn't make sense. Jenkins was looking at something in the snow near the fire pit. "Marcus, come look at this." I walked over and saw what had caught his attention. Footprints in the snow, but they were strange. They started near the largest tent, walked about 10 feet toward the lake, and then just stopped. Not like someone had kept walking, and the snow had covered the rest. They just ended, like whoever made them had vanished into the air. The prints looked human, but there was something odd about them. They seemed a little too wide, and there were strange marks near the toes, like scratches in the snow. Could be ice cleats, Jenkins said, but he didn't sound convinced. We spent 2 hours looking around the camp. No signs of struggle, no blood, no messages left behind. It was like 4 people had just disappeared, leaving behind a picture-perfect campsite that should have been destroyed by the storm. The radio crackled to life, making us both jump. Static filled the air, then a voice came through. It sounded far away and strange. Help us. Jenkins grabbed his radio. This is Ranger Station Wonder Lake. Who is this? What's your location? More static. Then the voice again, clearer this time. We're at the lake. Can you see us? We're right here. I looked toward Wonder Lake. Through my binoculars, I could see figures standing on the ice. 4 people, waving their arms. They looked small in the distance, but they were definitely there. That's them, Jenkins said, excited. Thank God they're okay. But something felt wrong. The research team's equipment was still at the camp. Why would they leave everything behind and walk onto the frozen lake? And how had they survived 3 days in a blizzard without their gear? Jenkins was already packing up to head toward the lake. Come on, Marcus, let's go get them. I took another look through the binoculars. The 4 figures were still there, still waving, but they weren't moving around the way people usually do when they're cold. They stood perfectly still, except for the waving. No jumping to keep warm. No huddling together. Jenkins, wait, I called, but he was already walking toward the lake. I followed him, but something in my gut told me this wasn't right. The air felt too still. The silence was too complete. And those footprints that ended in the middle of nowhere kept bothering me. As we got closer to the lake, I pulled out my thermal imaging scanner. It was military equipment that showed heat signatures. If there were 4 people standing on that ice, the scanner would pick up their body heat even from this distance. I pointed it toward the lake and looked through the viewfinder. Nothing. No heat signatures at all. The ice showed up as dark blue on the screen, meaning it was cold. But there was nothing showing the warm red and yellow colors of human bodies. Jenkins, I called out. The thermal scanner isn't picking them up. Maybe it's broken in this cold, he called back. He was about 100 yards ahead of me now, walking fast toward the lake. I looked with my regular binoculars again. The figures were still there, still waving, but now that I was closer, I could see their faces. Even from this distance, I recognized them. The research team. Dr. Sarah Chen, the team leader. Robert Martinez, the weather specialist. The other 2 I'd seen in their files. But something about their faces looked wrong. They were smiling. Big, wide smiles like they were having the best time of their lives. People who had been lost in a blizzard for 3 days don't smile like that. Jenkins, stop, I yelled. Something's not right here. He turned around, and I could see he was angry. What's wrong with you, Marcus? Those people need help. They've been out here for days. Look at them through the thermal scanner, I said. He borrowed my scanner and pointed it at the lake. I watched his face change as he looked through the viewfinder. The color drained out of his cheeks. There's nothing there, he whispered. We both looked at the lake with our regular binoculars. The 4 figures were gone. The ice was empty. That's when we heard the voices calling from behind us, back at the camp. Help, we're over here. Please help us. We turned around and saw 4 people standing near the research camp, waving their arms frantically. It was the same research team. Dr. Chen, Martinez, and the other 2. But now they looked desperate, scared. How did they? Jenkins started to say, then stopped. He was looking back and forth between the camp and the lake, trying to understand what he was seeing. Which ones are real? I asked quietly. The voices from the camp got louder. Please, we're hurt, we need help. Jenkins started walking toward the camp. We have to help them, he said. But I grabbed his arm. Wait, something's very wrong here. That's when I noticed his shadow. Jenkins was standing right next to me, but when I looked down at the snow, I could see my shadow clearly in the dim light. His shadow was wrong. It looked like the shadow of something much larger, with arms that were too long. I looked up at Jenkins' face. He looked normal, but his eyes seemed different. They reflected the light like an animal's eyes. "Come on, Marcus," he said, and his voice sounded just a little bit off, like someone trying to copy the way Jenkins talked. "Those people need our help." I stepped back from him. "You're not Jenkins." The thing that looked like Jenkins smiled at me. The smile was too wide for a human face. "Of course I'm Jenkins," it said in his voice. "What's wrong with you, Marcus?" "We need to help those people." I pulled out my emergency flare gun and backed away. "Where's the real Jenkins?" The fake Jenkins laughed, and the sound made my skin crawl. It was Jenkins' laugh, but there was something cruel about it. "You're losing it, partner. The cold is getting to you." I heard sounds from the direction of the lake, splashing noises, like something big moving around in water. But the lake was frozen solid. There shouldn't be any water sounds. "That's Jenkins," the thing said, pointing toward the lake. "He fell through the ice. You need to help him." From the lake came Jenkins' voice, screaming, "Marcus, help me. I'm in the water. It's so cold." I looked back and forth between the fake Jenkins standing in front of me and the sounds coming from the lake. The fake one was still smiling that horrible smile. "Choose quickly," it said. "He's drowning." I raised the flare gun. "Get away from me." The thing's smile got even wider. "You don't understand, Marcus. I'm trying to help you. There are things in this lake that are much worse than me." That's when I heard the real Jenkins scream again from the lake, and the sound was so full of terror that it made my blood freeze. I ran toward the water, leaving the fake Jenkins behind. When I got to the shore, I saw a hole in the ice about 20 feet from the edge. The hole was perfectly round, like it had been cut with a giant cookie cutter. Jenkins was in the water, holding onto the edge of the ice with his fingertips. "Marcus," he gasped. "Something grabbed me. Something pulled me down." I got down on my belly and crawled toward the hole, spreading my weight out so I wouldn't fall through. The ice was thick, at least 3 feet. Whatever had made that hole was incredibly strong. "Grab my hand," I called to Jenkins. He reached for me, but just as our fingers touched, something jerked him backward. He disappeared under the water with a splash. I waited for him to come back up. 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. The water in the hole was perfectly still. "Jenkins," I yelled. No answer. I took off my pack and pulled out a waterproof flashlight. I shined it down into the hole, trying to see into the dark water below the ice. Something shined back at me. 2 yellow eyes, bigger than human eyes. They were about 15 feet down, staring up at me. As I watched, they moved closer to the surface. I scrambled backward just as something burst up out of the hole. It wasn't Jenkins. It was like a man, but wrong. 8 feet tall, covered in dark, wet fur. Its face was stretched out like an otter, with a black nose and whiskers. Its hands ended in claws that looked like they could cut through metal. Water dripped from its fur, but it didn't seem bothered by the cold at all. This was the Kushtaka from my grandmother's stories. The thing that steals souls. It looked at me with those yellow eyes and spoke in Jenkins' voice. "Help me, Marcus. It's so cold in the water." Behind me, I heard the fake Jenkins walking up. "Looks like the real Jenkins won't be needing our help anymore," it said. And when I turned around, it wasn't wearing Jenkins' face anymore. It looked just like the creature from the water. I was surrounded. The one from the water climbed up onto the ice. Its claws made scratching sounds as it pulled itself out of the hole. When it stood up, I could see how powerful it was. Its arms were longer than human arms, and its shoulders were broad like a weightlifter's. "We've been waiting for you, Marcus," the first creature said. "Your grandmother told you about us, didn't she?" I pointed my flare gun at the closer one. "Stay back. Fire won't help you here," it said. "This is our territory. We know every inch of this lake, every crack in the ice. There's nowhere for you to run." The creature that had come out of the water started walking toward me. Each step left wet claw marks in the snow. "Do you want to know what happened to your friend Jenkins?" I didn't answer, but it kept talking anyway. "He trusted us. When we called to him in your voice, he came right to the edge of the ice. He thought you had fallen through. He wanted to save you." The first creature laughed. "Humans are so easy to fool. You care about each other. That makes you weak." "Where are the research team?" I demanded. "They're safe," the water creature said. "They're with us now. Under the ice. They'll stay there forever, and they'll never be cold again." I realized what it meant. The research team was dead. They had been dead for days. These things had been using their shapes to lure me and Jenkins to the lake. Why? I asked. Because we're hungry, the first creature said simply, and because we can. That's when I remembered something my grandmother had taught me. She said the Kushtaka were afraid of fire, and they couldn't cross running water while they were in their true form. I didn't see any running water, but I had something else. I fired the flare gun at the creature closest to me. The bright red flare hit it in the chest and exploded in a shower of sparks. The creature screamed, a sound like a wounded animal, and stumbled backward. "Fire!" it shrieked. "He has fire!" The other creature hissed and backed away from me. I pulled out another flare from my pack and lit it with a match. The red light pushed back the darkness, and both creatures moved farther away. "This won't last forever," the first creature snarled. "You only have so many flares." "We have all the time in the world." I started backing away from the lake, keeping the flare pointed toward them. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how to get out of this situation. I was miles from the nearest radio, and these things were faster and stronger than me. That's when I remembered something else my grandmother had taught me. A protection chant in the old Tlingit language. I had never believed in it before, but nothing else was working. I started saying the words, stumbling over the pronunciation. It was a chant asking the spirits of my ancestors to protect me from evil. Both creatures stopped moving. Their yellow eyes went wide. "He knows the old words," one whispered to the other. "Impossible," the second one said. "The young ones have forgotten." I kept chanting, holding the flare high. The creatures were backing away now, actually scared of something for the first time. But I only had 3 flares left, and it was getting dark. Soon, I would be alone in the wilderness with these things hunting me. I had to find a way to get back to the ranger station, and I had to do it fast. The problem was, I wasn't sure I could trust anything I saw anymore. If these creatures could look like Jenkins and the research team, how would I know what was real and what was fake? I backed away from the lake, keeping the flare between me and the creatures. They followed me, staying just outside the circle of red light, moving like wolves stalking prey. Their yellow eyes reflected the flames, making them look like evil spirits in the darkness. The temperature was dropping fast as the sun disappeared completely. Soon it would be 50 below zero. I had to find shelter, but I couldn't go back to the research camp. Those things might have more tricks waiting for me there. I remembered a small emergency shelter about 2 miles east of the lake. It was just a tiny cabin with supplies for lost hikers. If I could reach it, I might be able to wait until morning and figure out how to call for help. I lit a second flare as the first one started to burn low. The creatures hissed and moved back again. "You can't keep this up forever," the larger one called out. "We know where you're going. We know every shelter, every hiding place. We've been hunting in these woods for hundreds of years." I didn't answer. I just kept walking, trying to remember the path to the emergency shelter. In the dark, with snow covering everything, it was hard to tell which direction to go. Behind me, I could hear the creatures whispering to each other in a language I didn't understand. It sounded like water flowing over rocks, with clicking sounds mixed in. After about an hour of walking, I saw a light ahead through the trees. It was the emergency shelter, with a warm yellow glow coming from the windows. Someone had lit the oil lamps inside. My heart jumped with hope. Maybe there were other rangers there. Maybe help had arrived. But then I remembered, I was supposed to be the only ranger in this area. Who else would be at the shelter? I stopped walking and studied the cabin carefully. Through the windows, I could see shadows moving around inside. It looked like 3 or 4 people were in there, talking and moving around like they were having a normal conversation. One of the shadows came to the window and waved at me. It looked like Jenkins. I lit my third flare and pointed it toward the cabin. "I know you're not real," I yelled. The shadow in the window stopped waving. Then all the lights in the cabin went out at once. The creatures behind me started laughing. "Did you think we only had 2 shapes?" One of them called out. "We can be anyone you've ever known. We can be everyone you've ever trusted." The cabin door opened, and my grandmother walked out. She looked exactly like I remembered her from when I was a child, small and wrinkled, with long gray hair braided down her back. She was wearing the traditional Tlingit clothes she used to wear for ceremonies. "Marcus," she called in, her gentle voice. "Come inside, grandson. It's cold out there." For a moment, I almost believed it. She looked so real, so much like the grandmother I loved. But then I remembered she had been dead for 5 years. "You're not her," I said. "Of course I am," the fake grandmother said. "I've come back to help you. These creatures are dangerous, but I know how to protect you. Come inside and I'll teach you the old ways." Behind me, the real creatures had gone quiet. I couldn't see them anymore, but I knew they were still there. "If you're really my grandmother," I called out, "tell me the end of the protection chant you taught me." The fake grandmother's face changed. The kind expression became cold and angry. "You dare test me, boy?" Real grandmother never would have called me boy. She always called me by my name or grandson. I pointed my flare at the thing wearing my grandmother's shape. "Get away from me." The fake grandmother's form began to change. Her small body grew taller and broader. Her hands stretched into claws. Her face extended into the otter-like snout I had seen before. In seconds, it had become another Kushtaka. "Fine," it snarled. "No more games, no more tricks. We'll take you the hard way." I heard movement in the trees around me. More creatures were coming out of the forest. I could see their eyes reflecting my flare light. 5, 6, maybe 7 of them. They had been hiding, waiting for the right moment. This was it. I was surrounded, almost out of flares, and miles from any real help. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the rest of my grandmother's protection chant. The real one had taught it to me when I was 7 years old, making me repeat it until I had it memorized. She said it would protect me from evil spirits, but I had never believed her. Now it was my only hope. I started chanting in Tlingit, speaking the old words as clearly as I could remember them. The creatures stopped moving toward me. Some of them actually stepped backward. I opened my eyes and saw that my flare was burning brighter. The red light seemed stronger, pushing further back into the darkness. "Impossible," one of the creatures whispered. "He has the protection of the ancestors." "It won't last," another one said. "The old magic is weak now. No one believes in it anymore." But I could feel something changing. The air around me felt warmer, even though the temperature was still dropping. I felt like I wasn't alone anymore, like someone was standing beside me. I continued the chant, and my voice got stronger. Some of the words came back to me that I thought I had forgotten. It was like my grandmother was whispering them in my ear. The creatures started backing away further. A couple of them disappeared back into the trees. "This isn't over," the largest one called out. "We know where you live. We know where you work. We'll find you again." But it was backing away too, moving toward the lake. I kept chanting until I couldn't see any of their eyes in the darkness anymore. Then I lit my last flare and started walking toward the real emergency shelter. Not the one they had been using to trick me, but the real one I knew was about half a mile north. I walked through the forest all night, stopping only to light matches to keep some light around me. Every shadow looked like it might be one of the creatures. Every sound made me jump, but they didn't come back. Whatever power my grandmother's chant had called up, it was protecting me. Just as the sun started to come up, I found the real emergency shelter. It was cold and dark inside, but it was real. I barricaded the door, lit the oil heater, and used the emergency radio to call for help. The rescue helicopter found me 12 hours later. I had frostbite on 3 fingers and both feet, but I was alive. The military search team found Jenkins' body in the lake 3 days later. He had drowned, just like the creatures said. They also found the 4 research team members in a crevasse about a mile from their camp. They had been dead for almost a week. The official report said the research team died in an accident during the blizzard. Jenkins was listed as drowning after falling through thin ice while searching for them. Equipment failure and extreme weather were blamed for everything. No one mentioned creatures or missing time or impossible things. But I know what really happened out there. I spent 2 months in the hospital recovering from the frostbite. When I got out, I went to visit my grandmother's sister, who was the only person left alive who remembered the old stories. I asked her to teach me more about the Kushtaka and how to protect against them. She taught me other chants, other protections. She gave me a small bag of sacred items to carry with me: eagle feathers, special stones, dried herbs that were supposed to keep evil spirits away. I carry that bag with me every day now. I also learned that my grandmother had always known I would face something like this. My great-aunt told me that my grandmother had seen it in a dream when I was born. She said that's why she taught me the protection chant, even though I didn't believe in it at the time. The old spirits knew you would need their help, my great-aunt told me. They were watching over you that night. I went back to work as a park ranger, but I requested a transfer away from Wonder Lake. The Park Service was happy to move me after what happened. They said I had been through trauma and needed a change of scenery. But I kept hearing reports from other rangers working that area. Hikers going missing in ways that didn't make sense. Search teams finding empty camps that looked too perfect. Radio calls that came from people who turned out to be already dead. The Wonder Lake area is restricted during winter months now. The official reason is dangerous ice conditions, but I know the real reason. The Park Service doesn't want to lose any more people to things they can't explain or fight. Sometimes I still have nightmares about that night. I dream about Jenkins calling for help from under the ice, or about creatures wearing the faces of people I love. But when I wake up, I say my grandmother's protection chant, and the fear goes away. I've learned to listen to the old stories with respect now. When indigenous elders tell tales about spirits and creatures in the wilderness, I pay attention. They're not just stories. They're warnings passed down from people who survived encounters with things that most folks don't believe in. A few years ago, I was training a new ranger, a young guy fresh out of college. He asked me if I believed in Bigfoot or any of that cryptid stuff. I told him what I always tell the new guys now. If you're ever out there and you see someone you know acting just a little bit wrong, if their shadow doesn't match their body, if they're not cold when they should be, if they want you to go somewhere that doesn't feel right, trust your instincts. It might not be who you think it is. Most of them laugh and think I'm just an old ranger trying to spook them. But a few pay attention. Those are the ones who come back from their patrols with all their fingers and toes. Alaska has things living in it that make the cryptids in the lower 48 states look like house pets. Things that have been hunting here since before humans crossed the land bridge from Asia. Things that remember when the glaciers covered half the continent. The Kushtaka wasn't my only encounter with the supernatural up here, but it was the one that taught me to respect the old ways. It taught me that some of the stories our ancestors told weren't meant to entertain kids around a campfire. They were meant to keep people alive. If you ever find yourself alone in the Alaska wilderness, remember this. If something seems too good to be true, it probably is. If someone you trust is leading you toward deep water or thin ice, ask yourself why. And if you ever hear someone calling for help from a place where no one should be, maybe you should think twice before you go to help them. Because sometimes, the thing calling for help is the same thing that put your friend in danger in the first place. The creatures are still out there, they're still hunting, and they're very, very patient. But now I know how to fight back. And if you ever need to know the old protections, the old ways to keep safe from things that steal souls, you can find me at any Alaska Ranger station. Just ask for Marcus Ironwood. I'll be the one carrying eagle feathers and speaking words in a language older than this country. Because my grandmother was right about more than just the Kushtaka. She was right when she told me that the old spirits would protect me if I showed them respect, and they're still protecting me today. My name is David Midnight, and I've been a park ranger for 20 years. I've seen things in the wilderness that would make most people pack up and head back to the city. But what happened during the endless night of '79 in Alaska's Brooks Range still keeps me awake sometimes. I'm 44 now, half Gwich'in on my mother's side. She used to tell me stories about the aurora, the northern lights, that her grandmother passed down. Stories about hungry spirits that lived in those dancing green curtains across the winter sky. I always thought they were just old tales meant to keep kids from wandering off at night. 20 years of ranger work teaches you to trust facts, not folklore. I'd survived 23 Arctic emergencies, pulled people out of situations that should have killed them. Hypothermia, avalanches, bear attacks, you name it. I could speak fluent Gwich'in thanks to my mom, and I knew these mountains like most people know their living rooms. The Brooks Range was my territory, 200 miles north of the Arctic Circle, where winter means 67 days without sun. That December, I was stationed at the main ranger post when the call came in. Dr. Sarah Chen from the Aurora Research Station hadn't checked in for 3 days. The station was a small operation, just 5 researchers studying the northern lights during peak winter activity. They were camped about 30 miles northeast, completely cut off once the snows came. No road access, just helicopter drops for supplies. Probably just radio trouble, my supervisor said, but protocol was protocol. Someone had to make the trek out there and do a wellness check. I'd been to the station twice before. The researchers were city folks mostly, but they seemed to know their business. They'd set up their equipment on an old Gwich'in hunting ground, a place my grandmother always said was special. Not good special, the kind of special you avoid. The weather had been strange that winter, even for the Arctic. The aurora activity was off the charts, dancing across the sky even when it should have been quiet. Green curtains would shimmer for hours, sometimes shifting to purple and red. Beautiful, but wrong somehow. Like watching a wildfire that never consumed anything. I packed my gear and loaded the snowmobile. The plan was simple: ski out to the station, check on the team, make sure their heaters were working and nobody was showing signs of cabin fever. Maybe stay the night if the weather turned bad, then head back. The ride took most of the day. The landscape was endless white, broken only by scattered stands of black spruce that looked like skeleton fingers reaching up from the snow. The cold was sharp enough to cut glass, 42 below, according to my thermometer. Even through my heavy gear, I could feel it trying to find ways inside. About 5 miles from the station, I started noticing things that didn't sit right. Caribou tracks, heading south in a straight line, like they were running from something. No wandering to feed, no natural movement patterns. Just panic tracks going as far south as I could see. Then I found the ravens. 7 of them, frozen solid in a perfect circle around a bare patch of ground. Not scattered by wind or predators, just arranged there like someone had placed them deliberately. Ravens are tough birds. They don't just drop dead from cold, especially not in patterns like that. I took pictures and kept going. The research station came into view just as the last bit of twilight faded. It was a collection of 4 small buildings connected by covered walkways: dormitory, lab, communications, and generator house. Warm yellow light glowed in the windows, and I could hear the steady hum of the generator. Everything looked normal from the outside. I parked the snowmobile and called out as I approached the main building. No answer. I knocked on the door and tried the handle. Unlocked. Hello? Anyone here? It's Ranger Midnight. The inside was too warm, like someone had cranked the heaters up full blast. I could hear voices coming from the back room, the common area where the team usually ate and relaxed. Normal conversation, nothing that sounded like trouble. I pulled off my outer gear and walked toward the voices, already planning what I'd say about the missed radio checks. But as I got closer, the voices seemed off, too quiet, and there was something strange about the rhythm, like people talking but not quite to each other. I reached the doorway and looked inside. 4 researchers sat around the table, perfectly still. Their eyes were open, staring straight ahead, but they weren't looking at anything in the room. Dr. Chen was there, along with Marcus, Elena, and the new graduate student whose name I couldn't remember. They were having a conversation, but their lips barely moved, and the words seemed to come from somewhere else. "The hunger grows stronger," Dr. Chen said in a flat, emotionless voice. "Soon the feast begins," Marcus replied, never blinking. That's when I noticed their eyes weren't quite right. In the lamplight, they seemed to shimmer with a faint green glow, like reflections on water. I stood in that doorway for what felt like 10 minutes, but was probably only seconds, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The rational part of my brain, the part trained in wilderness medicine and emergency response, started running through explanations. Carbon monoxide poisoning could cause confusion and strange behavior. So could severe hypothermia, even though the room was blazing hot. "Dr. Chen?" I called out. Louder this time. All 4 heads turned toward me in perfect unison, like they were connected by invisible strings. Their eyes locked onto mine, and I saw that green shimmer wasn't a trick of the light. It was coming from inside their pupils, pulsing gently like aurora light. "Ranger Midnight," Dr. Chen said, and her voice sounded normal again. The others blinked and seemed to come back to themselves. "You startled us. We were just discussing our research." But I'd heard what they'd really said. About hunger and feasts. "We missed your radio check 3 days ago," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Had to come out and make sure everyone was okay." 3 days? Elena looked genuinely confused. "Has it been 3 days?" The graduate student, Tommy, I remembered now, rubbed his eyes like he was waking up. "I feel like I've been dreaming," he said. "Weird dreams about flying." I did a quick visual assessment of the team. They all looked thin, like they hadn't been eating much, dark circles under their eyes. Their skin had an odd, pale quality, almost translucent. Classic signs of isolation, stress, and poor nutrition. "When's the last time you all had a proper meal?" I asked. They looked at each other with blank expressions, like I'd asked them to solve advanced calculus. "We've been focused on our work," Marcus finally said. "The Aurora activity has been unprecedented. We can't afford to miss any data." I walked over to their small kitchen area and checked the supplies. Plenty of food, but most of it looked untouched. The refrigerator was still running, but when I opened it, everything inside had a strange smell. Not spoiled exactly, but wrong, like meat left too long in open air. "I'm going to check your equipment," I announced. "Make sure you don't have a carbon monoxide leak or something affecting your thinking." Dr. Chen stood up quickly. "That's not necessary. We're fine." "Protocol," I said firmly. "If there's a gas leak, it could kill you all before morning." She sat back down, but I caught her exchanging glances with the others, not the normal looks of people who were embarrassed about missing radio calls. Something else, like they were communicating without words. I went outside to check the generator house first. The equipment looked normal, diesel generator running clean, exhaust venting properly, no obvious signs of carbon monoxide problems. But the whole area around the building felt wrong. The snow was melted in weird patterns, forming shapes that almost looked like symbols, and it was warm, much warmer than it should be, with just the exhaust from a small generator. Back inside, I found the team exactly where I'd left them, sitting around the table in perfect stillness. But they weren't talking this time, just staring at each other with those faintly glowing eyes. "I need to use your radio," I said. "Check in with base." "It's not working," Tommy said quickly. "Has been acting up for days." I tried it anyway. The radio powered on fine, but when I tried to transmit, all I got was static filled with what sounded like whispers in a language I didn't recognize. I spoke enough Gwich'in to know it wasn't that, and enough basic French and Spanish to rule those out too. This was something else entirely. "We should try to fix this in the morning," I said. "I'll stay the night and take a look at the antenna." "No." Dr. Chen's voice was sharp, almost panicked. "I mean, there's no need. We can manage until the next supply drop." But I was already committed. Something was seriously wrong here, and leaving them alone wasn't an option. I set up my sleeping bag in the common room, where I could keep an eye on everyone. Around midnight, the northern lights came out. I woke to a sound like singing, but not quite human. Through the window, I could see the aurora dancing across the sky. Brilliant green curtains shot through with purple and red, moving in patterns I'd never seen before. They seemed to pulse in rhythm with the strange singing. The research team was gone. I grabbed my flashlight and went looking for them. Found all four standing outside in the snow, wearing just their regular clothes. No coats, no boots, no protection against the -40 cold. They should have been dead in minutes. But they weren't even shivering. They stood in a perfect line facing north, arms raised toward the aurora, singing in that same unknown language I'd heard on the radio. Their breath didn't fog in the frigid air. Their eyes were completely lit up now, glowing bright green like small aurora displays in their skulls. "Dr. Chen!" I shouted, but none of them responded. I approached slowly, calling their names. When I got within 10 feet, Tommy turned to look at me. His face was completely expressionless, and when he opened his mouth to speak, his voice came out layered, like multiple people talking at once. "The hungry ones call us home," he said. "Soon we join the eternal feast." Then he rose 6 feet off the ground and hung there, still facing the aurora, still singing. I ran back to the radio and tried every frequency I could think of. Finally got through to base on an emergency channel, but all I could manage was, "Aurora Research Station, need immediate evacuation. Something's wrong with the team." Before I could say more, the radio died completely. When I looked outside again, all four researchers were floating above the snow, their bodies rigid, their eyes blazing with aurora light. And the northern lights were getting brighter, reaching down from the sky like searching fingers. I spent that night barricaded inside the main building, watching through the windows as the research team floated in the aurora light. They stayed up there for hours, perfectly still, like they were suspended from invisible wires. Around dawn, the northern lights faded, and they gently settled back to the ground. By the time I worked up the courage to go outside, they were walking back to the buildings like nothing had happened. But their eyes still held that faint green glow, and they moved differently, too smooth, too coordinated, like they were marching to music only they could hear. "Morning, David," Dr. Chen said as she passed me. Her voice sounded normal, but she hadn't used my first name before. Sleep well? Sleep well? I tried to ask them what they remembered about the night, but they all claimed they'd slept straight through. When I described what I'd seen, they looked at me with polite concern, like I was the one acting strange. You must have had some vivid dreams, Marcus suggested. The isolation can play tricks on your mind. But I knew what I'd seen. And I knew I needed help. I spent the morning trying to fix the radio, but every time I got it working, the same whispered voices would fill the static until the equipment overloaded and shut down. It was like something was actively jamming our communications. By afternoon, I'd made a decision. I would ski back to base, get a proper rescue team, and return with backup and medical equipment. Whatever was affecting the research team was beyond my ability to handle alone. I was loading my gear when Elena approached me. She moved with that same unnaturally smooth walk, and her eyes held more green light than before. You can't leave us, David, she said. We need you here. You need medical attention, I replied. All of you. Something's making you sick. We're not sick, she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. We're becoming something more. Before I could respond, she reached out and grabbed my wrist. Her grip was impossibly strong, and her skin was warm despite the sub-zero temperature. For just a moment, I felt something try to push into my mind, a presence that felt vast and hungry and ancient. I jerked away and stumbled backward. Elena tilted her head like a curious bird. You have strong barriers, she said. Your grandmother taught you well. That stopped me cold. I'd never mentioned my grandmother to any of them. I got on the snowmobile and started the engine, but Elena didn't move out of my way. She just stood there smiling as I revved the motor and inched forward. Finally, I had to drive around her, and as I passed, I heard her whisper something in perfect Gwich'in. The lights will have you before you reach the trees. I made it about 10 miles before the aurora started dancing in broad daylight. Green curtains shimmered across the afternoon sky, impossible and beautiful. The snowmobile engine coughed and died. I tried to restart it, but the electrical system was completely dead. Even my flashlight wouldn't work. The aurora began reaching down toward me, tentacles of light that moved with obvious purpose. I abandoned the snowmobile and started skiing, following my own tracks back toward the research station. Behind me, I could hear the aurora singing in that strange language, and the sound was getting closer. I made it back just as the sun set, and the natural aurora season began. The research team was waiting for me in the common room, sitting in that same perfect stillness. But now their eyes blazed like green stars, and when they smiled at me, I could see that their teeth had grown sharp. Welcome home, David, Dr. Chen said, and her voice echoed like it was coming from the bottom of a deep well. That's when I understood what my grandmother's stories had really been trying to tell me. The aurora wasn't just light in the sky. It was alive, and it was hungry, and it had been feeding on isolated people in the Arctic for longer than anyone remembered. I thought about my partner, Susan Brightstar, back at the main station. She'd be expecting my radio check soon. If I didn't make contact, she'd come looking for me. And then she'd end up just like the research team. I need to radio base, I said. Let them know I'm staying another night. The radio still isn't working, Tommy said. But when I went to check it, the equipment powered on just fine. I managed to reach Susan on the first try. David, thank God. We've been worried. How's the situation out there? I looked at the research team. They were all watching me with those glowing eyes, their sharp-toothed smiles never wavering. Everything's fine, I heard myself say. Just some equipment problems. I'll stay another night and head back tomorrow. But I hadn't decided to say those words. They'd come out of my mouth on their own. Copy that, Susan's voice crackled through the speaker. See you tomorrow. The radio went dead, and Dr. Chen nodded approvingly. You're learning, she said. The lights are teaching you. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I wanted to scream, but my voice was gone. Something invisible was wrapping around my mind, and I could feel myself starting to slip away. Then I remembered my grandmother's voice, singing an old song in Gwich'in, a protection song. I started humming it under my breath, and the presence in my head recoiled like it had been burned. The research team hissed in unison and stepped back. Strong barriers, Elena repeated, but they won't hold forever. Outside, the aurora was growing brighter, and I could feel it pressing against the windows like a living thing trying to get inside. I spent that second night locked in the generator house, the only building without windows facing north. I'd found some sage in my emergency kit. My grandmother had taught me to always carry it, and I burned it while singing every protection song I could remember in Gwich'in. The aurora raged outside like a storm, and I could hear the research team moving around the compound, their voices layered and inhuman as they called my name. Sometimes they sounded like themselves, begging for help. Other times they spoke in that ancient language, and the words made my teeth ache. Around 3 a.m., Susan Brightstar arrived. I heard the snowmobile engine over the aurora's singing and felt a moment of relief that turned instantly to horror. She was walking into the same trap that had taken the research team. I tried to leave the generator house to warn her, but the moment I opened the door, the aurora light hit me like a physical force. It felt like hooks trying to drag something out of my skull. I slammed the door shut and kept burning sage. Through the walls, I heard Susan calling out, then the sound of conversation. Normal voices, explanations about radio trouble, and delayed schedules. The research team was still human enough to be convincing when they needed to be. By morning, Susan was one of them. She came to the generator house door and spoke in her normal voice, asking me to come out and discuss the situation. But when I looked through the small window, her eyes held that same green glow. "David, you're being paranoid," she said. "Come out, we need to talk about getting everyone evacuated." For a moment, I almost believed her. Susan was my partner, someone I trusted with my life. Maybe I really was losing my mind from isolation and stress. Maybe the aurora lights were just coincidence, and the research team was suffering from some kind of group psychosis that made me imagine impossible things. Then I noticed her shadow. It was moving independently of her body, reaching toward the door like grasping fingers. I started burning more sage and singing louder. Susan's voice changed, becoming layered and strange. "Your grandmother's songs are old and weak," she said. "The lights are eternal. They will have you eventually." But the songs were working. Every time I sang, the presence trying to push into my mind retreated. My grandmother hadn't just taught me children's stories, she'd given me weapons. I spent the day preparing for the final confrontation I knew was coming. I tore pages from my notebook and wrote down every protection song I could remember, in case my memory failed. I gathered all the sage I had and prepared to burn it all at once if necessary. And I made peace with the fact that I probably wasn't going home. That night, the aurora was stronger than I'd ever seen it. The light was so bright it cast shadows inside the generator house, seeping through the walls themselves. The research team and Susan gathered outside the door, and their voices joined together in that inhuman singing. "David Midnight," they called in unison. "Beloved of the dark hour, come to us, join the eternal feast." The door began to glow and buckle inward. Whatever was possessing them was done being subtle. I lit all my sage at once and started singing the strongest protection song my grandmother had taught me. The one she said was only for the most desperate situations, when the spirits of the aurora came hunting. The door exploded inward, but instead of my friends, creatures of living light poured through. They had human shapes but moved like liquid, and their eyes were stars. Behind them came Susan and the research team, floating a foot off the ground, their bodies rigid and their mouths open in that endless song. The sage smoke made the light creatures recoil, but they kept coming. I sang louder, putting everything my grandmother had taught me into the words. The old language felt powerful in my mouth, like it was made for fighting things like this. One of the creatures reached for me, and when the sage smoke touched it, it screamed with a sound like breaking glass. But there were 5 of them, and only one of me. Then I heard another voice joining my song. Susan was fighting back. Her body was still controlled by the aurora spirits, but part of her mind was free, and she was adding her voice to mine. She'd learned some Gwich'in from me over the years, and she remembered enough of the protection songs to help. The creature possessing her writhed and hissed, trying to stop her, but Susan kept singing. Blood ran from her nose and ears from the effort, but she didn't stop. Together, our voices drove the light creatures back toward the door. They retreated like smoke, flowing out into the night. But Susan collapsed as they left, and I could see that fighting them had cost her everything. "David," she whispered, her eyes clear for the first time since she'd arrived. "They're not gone, they're just waiting. When the sage runs out," she was right. Outside, the aurora was regrouping, gathering strength, and my sage was almost burned out. "There's a way," Susan said, her voice getting weaker. Your grandmother's song, the one about sending them home, but it requires. She died before she could finish the sentence. I held her body and cried, listening to the aurora creatures circling the building like predators. In the distance, I could hear the research team calling my name, but their voices were completely inhuman now. Then I remembered the song Susan meant, the one my grandmother had made me promise never to sing unless there was no other choice. Because singing it required offering yourself as bait to draw all the hungry spirits into one place, then banishing them back to the space between stars. The singer didn't survive it, but sometimes, my grandmother had said, one life was worth many. I began to sing the banishment song. The song took 3 hours to complete. As I sang, the aurora spirits came flowing back into the building, drawn by the power of the ancient words. They couldn't resist it. The song was designed to call them like moths to flame. They poured into me, filling me with their hunger and their alien thoughts. I felt myself lifting off the ground as they had lifted the research team. My eyes blazed with green light, and my voice became layered with theirs as we sang together. But the song wasn't inviting them to stay. It was a trap. As the final verses left my lips, the spirits found themselves bound to my voice, unable to escape. The Gwich'in words wrapped around them like chains, and when I spoke the last syllable, we were all pulled together into the space between the earth and sky. For a moment that lasted forever, I hung in star-filled darkness with the hungry lights. They showed me their true nature, ancient things that had fed on isolated humans since the first people came to the Arctic. They were not evil, exactly, just alien and predatory, like wolves made of light and time. Then the banishment completed, and they were cast back to the deep cold between stars where they belonged. I woke up 3 days later in an Anchorage hospital. A search and rescue team had found me unconscious in the generator house, suffering from severe hypothermia and dehydration. The research team and Susan Brightstar were dead, officially from carbon monoxide poisoning caused by a faulty generator. The official report made no mention of aurora possession or floating bodies or impossible songs. Just a tragic accident in a dangerous place, the kind of thing that happens sometimes in Alaska's wilderness. But they retrofitted every research station north of the Arctic Circle with new ventilation systems after that. Systems that looked suspiciously like sage burners to anyone who knew what to look for. And they started requiring all Arctic personnel to carry certain emergency supplies that weren't in any official manual. I left the Park Service and moved back to my mother's village. The elders welcomed me home and taught me more of the old songs, not just protection, but healing and cleansing, and ways to recognize when the hungry lights start reaching down from the sky again. Because they do reach down, sometimes, especially during peak aurora activity in the deep winter. There are reports from research stations, isolated communities, anyone who spends too much time alone under the dancing lights. The official explanations are always the same: equipment failure, medical emergencies, tragic accidents. But the elders know better, and now, so do I. These days, I work as a traditional healer and wilderness guide. I teach people the old ways of staying safe in the Arctic, including some skills that aren't in any survival manual. I tell them about reading the signs when aurora activity gets dangerous, about carrying sage and knowing the protection songs. Most people think it's just colorful local folklore, but some listen with the kind of attention that tells me they've seen things they can't explain. Those are the ones I teach the real songs to, the ones who might need to sing them someday. My name is David Midnight, and I've learned that some hungers never die. They just wait between the stars for their chance to feed again. The northern lights are beautiful, but during peak winter activity, when you're alone in the deep wilderness, remember this: never stare directly at the aurora. And if you hear singing in a language you don't recognize, start singing back in any language you do know, loud and strong and without stopping, until the green light fades from the sky. Because some lights in the darkness aren't there to guide you home, they're there to take you somewhere else entirely. My name is Rachel Bearwood, and I've spent 13 years tracking Kodiak bears through some of the most dangerous wilderness on Earth. I've tagged 247 of them, survived 12 close encounters that should have killed me, and watched these massive predators hunt salmon with a grace that still takes my breath away. At 37, I thought I knew everything about bears. I was wrong. The morning everything changed started like any other August day on Kodiak Island. I was checking my gear at the Carlook Lake Ranger Station, preparing for another routine survey of the salmon spawning grounds. The air smelled of salt and rotting fish, and the mountains rose around me like sleeping giants covered in green. I'd been a wildlife ranger for 13 years, but before that, I spent 8 years as a zookeeper in Anchorage. Back then, I worked with black bears that seemed huge at 400 pounds. When I first saw my first wild Kodiak, an 8-foot male weighing nearly 1,000 pounds, I understood why the old Alutiiq people called this place the land of the bear spirits. But I never believed their stories about 20-foot bears that walked like men and spoke in ancient tongues. I was a scientist. I dealt in facts, measurements, and data. The biggest Kodiak bear on record was 12 feet tall and weighed 1,656 pounds. Anything bigger was just fishermen's tales and tourist nonsense. That morning, I was loading my tranquilizer gun and GPS collars when my radio crackled to life. "Rachel, you there?" It was Tom Henley, a hunting guide who'd been working these waters for 20 years. "Yeah, Tom, what's up?" His voice sounded strange, shaky. "I need you to come out to Bear Creek. Something's not right here." "Define not right." "Just, can you come? Bring your measuring tape." I grabbed my gear and hiked the 3 miles to Bear Creek, where Tom and his client were standing next to a small plane. The client, a wealthy businessman from Seattle, looked pale and kept glancing at the tree line. "Show me," I said. Tom led me 50 yards into the alders. "Here." I looked down and felt my stomach drop. In the soft mud beside the creek was a bear track. Not unusual, except this one was 18 inches long. I knelt down, pulled out my measuring tape, and checked twice. 18 inches. The biggest track I'd ever recorded was 14 inches. "Could be an old track," I said, though I knew it wasn't. The edges were sharp, fresh, made within hours. "Look at the trees," Tom whispered. I followed his gaze upward. 12 feet high on the trunk of a massive spruce were 4 parallel claw marks gouged deep into the bark. Fresh sap was still dripping. "No bear can reach that high," I said automatically, but I was staring right at proof that one could. The businessman spoke for the first time. "We heard it last night. Sounded like it was calling to something. Or someone." I spent 2 hours taking measurements and photos. The tracks led deeper into the forest, toward the old Alutiiq sacred sites that most people avoided. Each print was perfect, showing 5 distinct toes and claws longer than my fingers. As I packed up my equipment, Tom grabbed my arm. "Rachel, in 20 years of guiding, I've never been scared of a bear, but whatever made these tracks, I don't think it's just a bear." I told him he was being ridiculous, but as I hiked back to the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows between the trees. That night, I sat in my cabin reviewing the photos on my laptop. The tracks were real, the claw marks were real, but they suggested a bear that would weigh over 2,000 pounds and stand 15 feet tall on its hind legs. According to everything I knew about biology, such an animal was impossible. I was about to find out how wrong I was. 3 days later, I was back at Bear Creek with Dr. Peter Salmon, a wildlife biologist from the University of Alaska. Pete had flown in to help investigate what we were officially calling an exceptional individual specimen. Pete was 45, tall and thin, with the kind of careful precision that made him perfect for field research. We'd worked together before on population studies, and I trusted his judgment completely. "These tracks are definitely real," he said, kneeling beside a fresh print we'd found near the salmon pools. "But they don't match any known Kodiak bear anatomy. Could it be a hybrid? Some kind of mutation? Possible. But..." He trailed off, pointing to something I'd missed. "Look at the gait pattern." I studied the spacing between the tracks. Bears lumber when they walk, rolling from side to side. But these tracks were placed with deliberate precision, almost military in their straightness. "It's walking like a human," I whispered. "That's impossible," but the evidence was right there in the mud. We set up trail cameras at 3 locations along the creek and established a base camp about a mile downstream. The plan was simple: document the bear, assess its threat level, and determine if it needed to be relocated or destroyed. On the second night, we heard the calling. It started around midnight, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from the mountains themselves. Not quite a roar, not quite a howl. It was the sound an earthquake might make if it had vocal cords. That's not in any of my reference recordings, Pete said, fumbling with his audio equipment. The calling continued for nearly an hour, echoing off the peaks. Every few minutes, something else would answer from a different direction. Smaller voices, normal bear sounds, like they were responding to a leader. The next morning, we found our first trail camera destroyed. Not just broken, destroyed. The metal housing was twisted into an impossible pretzel shape, and the memory card was gone. The camera had been mounted 8 feet high on a tree trunk. Maybe it fell, Pete suggested, but we both knew better. There were fresh claw marks on the tree, and the camera's mounting bracket was still perfectly attached to the bark. What kind of strength does it take to do this? I asked, holding up the mangled remains. More than any bear should have. That afternoon, Tom Henley's voice crackled over the radio again. This time, he was screaming, "Mayday, mayday, bear attack at Salmon Point, we need immediate evac." Pete and I grabbed our gear and ran the 2 miles to Salmon Point, a popular fishing spot where guides often took their clients. We found Tom's boat beached at the water's edge, but no sign of Tom or his party. Blood painted the rocks in wide smears, leading up into the forest. Not droplets or spatters, thick, deliberate strokes, like something had dragged a body across the stones. "Tom," I called out. "Tom, can you hear me?" Silence. We followed the blood trail into the trees. 50 yards in, we found what was left of Tom's client. I've seen bear attacks before. They're usually quick, efficient, a skull crushed by powerful jaws, maybe some defensive wounds on the arms. This was different. This was methodical. The man had been partially eaten, but in a way that suggested intelligence rather than simple hunger. Specific organs were missing. The body was positioned deliberately, arms spread wide like an offering. "Jesus Christ," Pete whispered. "What kind of animal does this?" That's when we heard the breathing. It was coming from behind us, deep and slow, like a sleeping giant. We turned around slowly, and there it was. 20 feet away, barely visible in the shadow of a massive cedar, stood something that my brain refused to process. It was shaped like a bear, but wrong in every dimension. Too tall, too broad, with eyes that reflected light like mirrors. It was watching us with unmistakable intelligence. "Don't move," I whispered. "Don't even breathe." The creature tilted its head, studying us. Then it did something no bear has ever done in the history of animal behavior. It smiled. Not the aggressive lip-lifting of a threatened animal, but an actual human smile, showing teeth the size of railroad spikes. Then it spoke. "You do not belong here, little rangers." The voice was impossibly deep, echoing from somewhere inside a chest the size of a truck engine. But the words were clear, spoken in accented English, with what sounded like traces of an older language. Pete made a small choking sound and collapsed. The creature turned its attention to me. "You have been watching us. Now we watch you." Then it was gone, fading back into the forest like smoke, leaving only the smell of wild musk and ancient things. I dragged Pete back to our camp, both of us in shock. We called for immediate evacuation, reporting a dangerous bear attack. But in my report, I never mentioned what the bear had said. Who would have believed me? The evacuation helicopter took Pete back to Anchorage. He was conscious, but wouldn't speak, just stared at the ceiling with the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen something that broke his understanding of reality. I stayed behind. Call it professional duty or simple stubbornness, but I couldn't leave without answers. My supervisor, District Chief Karen Walsh, flew in the next morning with a team of federal wildlife investigators. Karen was a tough woman in her 50s who dealt with every kind of dangerous animal Alaska could produce. "Tell me again what happened," she said, reviewing my incident report. "Large, aggressive bear, approximately 15 feet tall. Killed 1 civilian, injured Dr. Salmon through shock trauma. Animal displays unusual intelligence and stalking behavior." All true. I just left out the part about it talking. 15 feet? Rachel, the largest recorded Kodiak, was 12 feet. I know what I saw. Karen studied my face. "You've been out here alone too long. These things happen. Isolation, stress, grief over the victim. It can play tricks on your perception." The tracks are still there. The blood evidence. The destroyed equipment, which all points to an unusually large but still perfectly natural predator. We're bringing in a hunting team tomorrow. 3 experienced guides with high-powered rifles. We'll track this animal and put it down. Karen, you don't understand. This isn't just a big bear, it's something else entirely. Rachel. Her voice carried the tone of someone making a final decision. You're emotionally compromised. I'm ordering you back to Anchorage for psychological evaluation. That night, after the team had set up camp, I snuck out with my gear. If they were going to hunt this thing, they needed to know what they were really dealing with. I followed the massive tracks deeper into the interior, beyond the tourist areas, into the wild heart of Kodiak Island, where the old Alutiiq people once performed their sacred ceremonies. The tracks led to a clearing surrounded by ancient petroglyphs carved into volcanic rock. The symbols showed bears in various poses, hunting, dancing, and in one disturbing image, consuming human figures while standing upright on two legs. In the center of the clearing was a circle of arranged bones. Not random animal remains, but deliberately placed skulls and femurs, forming a perfect spiral pattern. The bones were old, bleached white by years of weather, but the arrangement was fresh. I was photographing the bone circle when I heard voices behind me. Human voices. The federal team, they think they hunt us, one said. It was the same impossibly deep voice from the forest. Shall we show them the old ways? Asked another voice, higher pitched but still inhuman. The ranger woman watches, she learns, perhaps she is different. I turned around slowly. 3 creatures stood at the edge of the clearing. The largest was the one I'd seen before. A massive, bear-like thing that stood upright like a man. The other 2 were smaller, but still enormous, easily 12 feet tall. You came to the sacred place, the largest one said to me. You see the old markers, do you understand what they mean? My mouth was too dry to speak. They tell of the compact between your people and ours. When the first humans came to this island, they asked permission. They showed respect. They took only what was needed and left offerings for the spirits. It stepped closer, and I could see that its fur was marked with scars that looked almost like ritual tattoos. But your people forgot the compact. They come now with loud machines and bright lights. They take without asking. They kill without ceremony. They disturb the spawning grounds and sacred places. I didn't know, I managed to whisper. The elders told us to wait, to be patient. But when your hunters came for sport, when they killed the salmon guardian of the North Pool, it gestured to the bone circle. We decided to remind your people of the old agreements. What do you want? Respect. Recognition. The hunting permits in sacred areas to stop. Your people can share this island, but they must remember they are guests here. Behind me, I heard the sound of helicopters approaching. The hunting team was coming. They won't understand, I said. They'll try to kill you. We know. That is why you must choose, Ranger Woman. Help us, teach them the old ways, or watch them die trying to hunt the unkillable. The helicopters were getting closer, their rotors cutting through the morning air like mechanical thunder. They have guns, high-powered rifles. The creature that had been speaking smiled that terrifying human smile. And we have the island itself. As if on cue, the ground began to tremble. A low rumble built from deep underground, growing stronger. In the distance, I could hear rock slides starting on the mountain slopes. Choose quickly, Ranger Woman. The old spirits grow impatient. The earthquake lasted exactly 30 seconds. When it stopped, the helicopters were gone. I could hear them circling far to the south, probably dealing with their own emergencies. How did you do that? I asked. This island knows our voices, the largest creature said. We have been its guardians for 1,000 generations. Before your people came, before the Russians came, before even the first Alutiiq paddled these waters in their skin boats. I looked around the clearing again, really seeing it for the first time. The petroglyphs weren't just pictures, they were a historical record. Images of cooperation between humans and bear spirits, agreements sealed in stone. What's your name? I asked. Names have power, but you may call me grandfather, as the Alutiiq children did when they still came to learn the forest songs. Grandfather, the hunting team won't stop just because of one earthquake. They have orders to kill you. We know. That is why you must help us speak to them in a language they understand. In the distance, I could hear gunshots, rapid, panicked firing, then screaming. Then silence. What did you do? We did nothing. But the island has many guardians, and not all of them are as patient as we are. My radio crackled with desperate voices. Base camp, this is Hunter Team Alpha. We're under attack. Something's in the trees. Johnson is down. Repeat, Johnson is down. More gunfire. More screaming. Base camp, we need immediate extraction. This isn't a bear. I repeat, this is not a bear. Then static. They killed our salmon guardian, one of the smaller creatures said, speaking for the first time. Now the forest guardians want justice. Stop this, I said. They don't know what they're doing. Then teach them, grandfather said. You know our words now. You have seen our sacred places. Help us make the new compact. My radio crackled again. Any station, this is District Chief Walsh. We have multiple casualties and are requesting immediate military backup. Unknown hostiles have overrun our position. I made the hardest decision of my career. Karen, this is Rachel. Do not send military backup. Order immediate withdrawal from the interior. All personnel to return to coastal positions only. Rachel, where the hell are you? We've got some kind of situation here. I'm in the Sacred Grove. I'm with the Island Guardians. They want to make a deal. Long pause. Rachel, you're in shock. You need medical attention. Karen, listen to me very carefully. These aren't just bears. They're intelligent. They speak. They have rules. And if we don't follow those rules, none of us are leaving this island alive. That's impossible. Grandfather gestured for the radio. I hesitated, then handed it to him. District Chief Walsh, he said in that impossibly deep voice. This is the one your ranger calls grandfather. Your people have broken the ancient agreements. We offer you one chance to make new ones. The radio was silent for a full minute. Jesus Christ, Karen's voice came back, shaky now. What do you want? Safe passage for your people to leave our sacred places. No more hunting permits in the spawning grounds. No more aircraft over the ceremonial sites. Respect for the old boundaries. And in return, we will teach your rangers the proper protocols. Your people may visit as guests, not conquerors. The salmon runs will be protected for all. I could hear Karen talking to someone else, probably her superiors on satellite phone. Finally, she came back on the radio. We need time to discuss this with federal authorities. You have until sunset, grandfather said. After that, the mountain guardians wake, and they are much less reasonable than we are. As if to emphasize his point, a distant roar echoed from the peaks, something that sounded like no earthly animal. Rachel, Karen's voice was tight with fear. Can you guarantee safe passage for our people? I looked at grandfather, who nodded slowly. Yes, but Karen, when you tell this story to your superiors, tell them the truth. All of it. Because if they try to send hunters back here, what happened today will look like a friendly meeting. The radio went quiet. Grandfather turned to me. You have chosen well, Ranger woman, but the hardest part comes now. Your people do not like to admit they share the world with older, wiser beings. What happens to me now? What happens to me now? You become what you were always meant to be. A bridge between worlds, a speaker of the compact. The Alutiiq had a word for people like you, Bear Talker. As the sun began to set over Kodiak Island, painting the mountains red and gold, I realized my life as a simple wildlife ranger was over. I was about to become something much more dangerous, a woman who knew the truth. 6 months later, I sat in a federal conference room in Washington, D.C., giving testimony to a closed session of the Senate Subcommittee on Wildlife Management. The official records would show a routine briefing on large predator management in Alaska. The unofficial truth was something else entirely. Dr. Bearwood, the committee chairman said, please summarize your recommendations for Kodiak National Wildlife Refuge Management. Restricted access to sacred sites, permanent no-hunting zones around spawning grounds, and mandatory cultural sensitivity training for all park personnel. I said, the Alutiiq Tribal Council has agreed to provide traditional ecological knowledge to help us understand proper protocols. What I didn't say was that the Alutiiq elders had been in contact with the bear guardians for generations, quietly managing the relationship between two species that most people didn't even know coexisted. And the unusual bear activity you reported? Resolved through proper wildlife management techniques and community engagement, I said carefully. No further incidents have been reported. That was true. Once the new boundaries were established, the attacks stopped. Tom Henley's client was listed as a victim of exceptional predator encounter, and Tom himself had quietly moved his guide business to Southeast Alaska. Dr. Peter Salmon had taken early retirement and never spoke publicly about what he'd seen. The official story was that an unusually large but still natural Kodiak bear had been establishing territory during salmon season. Enhanced safety protocols and restricted access had solved the problem without requiring lethal intervention. After my testimony, I flew back to Kodiak Island, not as a federal ranger, but as the new cultural liaison specialist for the refuge. It was a position created specifically for me, with responsibilities that existed nowhere in the government job manual. My real job was maintaining the compact between humanity and the older residents of the island. Twice a month, I hiked to the sacred grove where grandfather and his council waited. They taught me the traditional protocols, the seasonal restrictions, the proper ways to ask permission before entering certain areas. In return, I translated their requirements into bureaucratic language that federal agencies could understand. Sensitive habitat protection instead of sacred sites. Wildlife corridor preservation instead of bear spirit migration routes. It worked, mostly. Tourist permits were quietly restricted. Hunting guides learned new rules they didn't quite understand, but followed anyway, after word spread about what had happened to the last group that didn't. Aircraft routes were adjusted to avoid certain peaks during certain seasons. Most people never knew they were participating in an ancient treaty between species. But sometimes, late at night in my cabin near Carlook Lake, I could hear the calling from the mountains. That deep, resonant voice that spoke of agreements older than governments, wilder than any law written by human hands. I would step outside and listen, and sometimes, if the wind was right, I could hear my own name carried down from the peaks. Bear Talker, the wind would whisper. Guardian of the compact, bridge between worlds. The tourists who visited Kodiak Island now often commented on how well-behaved the bears seemed, how they appeared to follow invisible rules about where they went and when. The local Alutiiq guides would smile and nod, speaking of traditional knowledge and ancestral wisdom. They never mentioned that some of those ancestors were still very much alive and watching from the shadows. My weekly reports to the Fish and Wildlife Service were models of bureaucratic normalcy. Bear population stable, human-wildlife conflicts at historic lows, visitor satisfaction high. No unusual incidents to report. But in my private journal, the one I kept locked in a safe in my cabin, I documented the truth. A successful first year of the renewed compact between humanity and the bear guardians of Kodiak Island. On my last entry before winter, I wrote, "The old agreements hold. Both species are learning to share the island again. But the guardians remind me often that this is just one place, one small success. There are other islands, other mountains, other sacred places where the old spirits still watch and wait. Somewhere in Alaska tonight, another ranger might be finding impossible tracks in the mud, wondering if they're losing their mind. I hope they make better choices than I almost did. I hope they remember that we are not the only intelligence on this planet, and we are certainly not the oldest. The bears are calling again. Time to go listen." My name is Maria Yukon, and I've been a park ranger at Glacier Bay National Park for 12 years. People always ask about my last name. Yeah, like the territory. My grandmother picked it when she came up from Mexico in the 50s. Said she wanted a name that belonged to the cold water and big sky. I work the Marine Wildlife Protection Unit, which means I spend most of my time on boats checking on seals, whales, and the tourists who come to see them. It's not glamorous work, but I love it. The water here is different than anywhere else. So cold it'll stop your heart in minutes, so deep you can't see bottom, even on the clearest days. The glaciers drop icebergs the size of houses right into the bay, and the sound they make when they hit, it's like the earth itself is crying. I never believed in sea monsters. Not until that fog-cursed morning in June of '91. Before I tell you what happened, you need to know I'm not some tourist who panics at every splash. I was Coast Guard for 8 years before I took this job. I've pulled bodies out of freezing water, survived 3 glacier calvings that could have crushed my boat like a beer can, and I know every whale migration pattern in these waters by heart. I speak decent Tlingit because you can't work these waters without knowing the people who've fished them for thousands of years. The old Tlingit fishermen used to warn me about something called kushtaka, ottermen who could change shape and steal souls. I used to smile and nod, the way you do when your grandfather tells you stories about the old days. I thought it was just folklore, something to keep kids from wandering too close to the water. I was wrong. It started with the Times Sarah's Dream Asterisk, a 30-foot fishing vessel that worked the crab runs near Johns Hopkins Glacier. Captain Joe Brennan had been fishing these waters for 20 years. Knew every rock, every current, every safe harbor between here and Juneau. His crew was experienced. Tommy Kessler and Frank Davis, both locals who'd grown up on boats. The Coast Guard found the Times Sarah's Dream Times drifting 2 miles from Johns Hopkins Inlet on June 15th. Engine running, lights on, coffee still hot in the galley, no distress signal, no sign of struggle, and no crew. They found the bodies 3 days later, washed up on a gravel beach near the glacier terminus. All 3 men were wearing their life jackets. All 3 had drowned in calm seas with perfect visibility. But when I saw those bodies, I knew something was very wrong. I'd seen plenty of drowning victims. Usually, they're peaceful looking, like they just went to sleep in the water. These men looked terrified. Their eyes were wide open, staring at something that scared them to death. And the marks on their bodies? The Coast Guard report called them post-mortem damage from marine scavengers. But I've seen what crabs and fish do to a body. This was different. These were claw marks. Deep, precise punctures in groups of 4. Too big for seals, too organized for random scavengers. They looked almost like finger marks, if fingers had claws instead of nails. The water temperature that day was 38 degrees. Even with survival suits, hypothermia would set in within minutes. These men were experienced. They wouldn't have just fallen overboard, especially not all 3 at once. And why were they still wearing their life jackets if they'd been attacked by some kind of marine predator? I kept thinking about those claw marks as I wrote my incident report. 4 parallel gouges, each about an inch deep. I'd seen similar marks once before, on a harbor seal that had been attacked by something near Bartlett Cove. The marine biologist couldn't identify what had made them. The next morning, I was back on the water in my patrol boat, the Times Raven's Wing Asterisk. The fog was thick as cotton, cutting visibility down to maybe 50 feet. I was checking the area where they'd found the Times Sarah's Dream Asterisk, looking for anything the Coast Guard might have missed. That's when I heard it for the first time. A howl. Long, mournful, echoing across the water like nothing I'd ever heard before. It sounded almost like a wolf, but wolves don't swim in Glacier Bay. It sounded almost human, but no human could make a sound that carried that far across open water. I cut my engine and listened. The fog muffled everything except the gentle lap of waves against my hull and the distant crack of glacier ice. Then it came again, that impossible howl, rising and falling like a siren song. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. I didn't report the howl in my log that day. How do you write up something like that? Heard unexplained vocalization during routine patrol? They'd think I was losing my mind, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. That sound had made every hair on my arm stand up, triggered some deep survival instinct that said Times Run asterisk. I'd heard plenty of strange sounds on the water, whale songs, wind through ice formations, even the groans of settling glaciers. This was different. This sounded aware. 3 days later, I got a call from Dr. Robert Taku, the marine biologist based out of Bartlett Cove. He wanted me to take him out to Johns Hopkins Inlet. There had been unusual seal behavior reported in the area, mass beachings, aggressive territorial displays, and what local guides described as howling. Bob was half Tlingit, half Scottish, and one of the smartest people I'd ever met. He'd studied marine mammals all over Alaska and had never seen anything that really stumped him. If he was concerned enough to ask for a boat ride, something significant was happening. We launched the Times Raven's Wing Times at dawn on June 22nd. The weather was perfect, clear skies, calm seas, visibility for miles. As we headed toward the glacier terminus, Bob told me what he'd learned from the local guides. They're saying the seals are acting like they're protecting something, he said, checking his underwater camera equipment. Forming defensive circles, posting sentries, refusing to leave certain areas even when threatened. That's not normal behavior for harbor seals. I thought about the claw marks on those 3 fishermen. Bob, have you ever seen anything that could make marks like this? I showed him the photos from the incident report. He studied them for a long moment, then looked out at the water. Those aren't from any marine mammal I know. The spacing is wrong for seal claws, too deep for sea otters, and the pattern, It's too organized. Almost like tool marks. We were about a mile from the glacier when Bob's depth sounder started acting up. The screen showed massive objects moving in the deep channels, shapes too large and too fast to be whales. They seemed to be pacing our boat, staying just out of sonar range. Could be a pod of orcas, Bob said, but he didn't sound convinced. Though I've never seen them behave like this. That's when we saw the seals. There had to be 200 of them, hauled out on a floating iceberg about a quarter-mile ahead. But they weren't lounging in the sun like seals normally do. They were all facing the water, lined up like soldiers on guard duty. As we got closer, I could see their heads turning to track our movement. Bob readied his camera. This is incredible. Look at that formation. They're organized like a defensive perimeter. I was watching the seals through binoculars when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Several of the larger ones were sitting upright, balanced on their tails like sea lions do. But harbor seals can't do that. They don't have the body structure for it. Bob, I said quietly, take a look at the big ones in the center. He raised his binoculars and went very still. After a long moment, he lowered them and looked at me. Those aren't harbor seals. The creatures in the center were massive, at least 7 feet long and built like bodybuilders. Their flippers looked almost like arms, and their heads looked too intelligent, too aware. They were watching us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. That's when the howling started. It came from the iceberg, from the gathered seals, but it didn't sound like any animal I knew. It was the same sound I'd heard 3 days ago, but now I could tell it wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus, rising and falling in complex harmonies that seemed almost like language. We need to get closer, Bob said, reaching for his underwater camera. I need to document this. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn around and head back to port. But Bob was right. This was something new, something important. I eased the Times Raven's wing times closer to the iceberg, keeping the engine at low throttle. The howling stopped. 200 seals went silent at exactly the same moment, like someone had flipped a switch. They were all staring at us now, and I could feel the weight of their attention like a physical pressure. The large ones in the center had moved to the edge of the ice, and I swear they looked like they were getting ready to slide into the water. Maybe we should back off, I said. Bob was leaning over the side with his camera when the water erupted. Something massive breached right next to our boat, close enough that the splash soaked us both. I got a glimpse of sleek black hide, powerful flippers, and eyes that looked far too human. Then it was gone, disappeared back into the dark water without a trace. Did you get that on camera? I asked, my heart hammering. Bob was staring at his camera's display screen, his face pale. You need to see this. The footage showed the creature as it breached, 7 feet of solid muscle, moving with impossible grace and power. But it was the head that made me grab the boat's rail for support. The skull was elongated like a seal's, but the face underneath, the face looked almost human. Intelligent eyes, expressive features, and something that might have been curiosity rather than animal instinct. That's not a seal, I whispered. No, Bob agreed, it's not. The radio crackled to life. Coast Guard Station Juneau to all vessels. Be advised, we have a distress call from the research vessel Times Northern Star Asterisk. Captain reports unusual marine life interference, approximately 2 miles northeast of Johns Hopkins Glacier, requesting immediate assistance. I looked at Bob. The research area was right where we were headed. Asterisk Raven's wing times responding. I radioed back. ETA 15 minutes. As we raced toward the coordinates, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were heading straight into something that was way over our heads. The creatures we'd just seen weren't just animals. They were organized, intelligent, and clearly territorial, and they'd just made contact with another boat. The Northern Star was dead in the water when we reached her, engines silent and crew gathered at the stern rail. Captain Mike Harrison was someone I'd known for years, a steady guy who ran geology surveys and tourist charters. He didn't rattle easily, but when he hailed us on the radio, his voice was shaking. Maria, thank God you're here. We need to get out of this area right now. I pulled the Times Raven's wing times alongside, and Bob jumped across to their deck. What happened, Mike? They came up from underneath, he said, pointing at the water around his boat. At least 6 of them, big as dolphins, but different. They were examining our hull, touching it with their flippers like they were trying to figure out what we were. His crew of 3 tourists and 2 graduate students were huddled together, all looking like they'd seen something that broke their understanding of the world. One of the students, a young woman with short dark hair, kept staring at the water and muttering. They looked at us. They looked times at times us. Where are they now? I asked. Mike pointed toward deeper water. They backed off when you showed up, but they're still out there. Look at your depth sounder. I checked the screen. There were at least 8 large objects circling our position at a depth of about 60 feet. They were moving in a coordinated pattern, like a military formation. Bob had his underwater camera ready. I'm going to try to get some footage. Bob, I don't think that's a good idea, I said, but he was already lowering the camera into the water on its tethered cable. For about 30 seconds, we saw nothing but dark water and drifting particles. Then shapes began to emerge from the gloom. Massive, sleek forms moving with purpose through the depths. As the camera focused, we could make out details that made everyone on both boats go quiet. They were definitely the same creatures we'd seen at the iceberg, but now we could see them clearly. 7-foot bodies that seemed to shift between seal-like and something more humanoid. Powerful flippers that looked almost like arms, and faces that were disturbingly intelligent. One of them swam directly toward the camera and stopped just a few feet away. It tilted its head, studying the lens with obvious curiosity. Then it did something that made my skin crawl. It reached out with one flipper and gently touched the camera housing, running what looked like claws along the metal surface. It's examining the equipment, Bob whispered. Look at that behavior. That's not instinct. That's investigation. The creature seemed to lose interest in the camera and swam upward, toward our boats. Through the clear water, we could see it approaching the surface, directly beneath the Times Northern Star asterisk. Everyone back from the rail, Mike ordered, but it was too late. The creature broke the surface in the space between the 2 boats, rising up out of the water until its head and shoulders were visible. This close, there was no mistaking what we were seeing. The body was seal-like, but the torso was wrong, too long, too muscular. The flippers were articulated like arms, with distinct digits ending in curved claws. And the face was the most disturbing thing I'd ever seen. It had the elongated skull of a marine mammal, but the eyes were large, dark, and unmistakably aware. When it looked at us, I felt like it was taking our measure, deciding what we were and whether we posed a threat. Then it spoke, not in words, but in that same howling sound we'd heard before. Only now, this close, I could hear the complexity of it, rising and falling tones that seemed almost like language. The creature was trying to communicate with us. Bob was recording everything, his hands shaking with excitement. This is incredible. This is a completely unknown species. Do you realize what this means? I was more worried about what it meant for our immediate survival. The creature was massive, clearly intelligent, and we were miles from help in small boats. But it hadn't shown any aggression, yet. The creature sank back below the surface and disappeared. For a moment, I thought it was over. Then my radio crackled with a transmission that made my blood freeze. Coast Guard Station Juneau. This is fishing vessel, Times Mary Catherine, asterisk. Mayday, Mayday. We are under attack by. I don't know what these things are. They're not seals. They're not. Oh God, they're coming over the side. The transmission cut to static. Bob and I looked at each other. The Times Mary Catherine Times was Tom Bradley's boat. He fished the waters near Marjorie Glacier, about 6 miles from our current position. We have to help them, I said, already starting the Times Raven's Wing asterisk engines. Mike grabbed my arm. Maria, whatever those things are, they just attacked a fishing boat. You can't go out there in a 24-foot patrol boat. But I was already pulling away from the Times Northern Star asterisk. Bob jumped back aboard, just as I gunned the engines toward Marjorie Glacier. Behind us, Mike was radioing the Coast Guard for backup, but I knew it would take them at least an hour to reach us. We were on our own. The Times Mary Catherine Times was drifting when we found her, but she was still afloat. There was no response to our radio calls. I brought the Times Raven's Wing Times alongside, and we could see why. The deck was torn apart. Not damaged, torn apart, like something with incredible strength had ripped through the equipment and superstructure. Crab pots were scattered and broken, the winch was twisted into scrap metal, and there were claw marks gouged deep into the wooden deck. Tom, I called out. Anyone aboard? Bob was studying the damage. Look at these marks. Maria. Whatever did this was incredibly strong, but also precise. This isn't random destruction. They were looking for something. We found Tom Bradley in the wheelhouse, unconscious but alive. He had deep scratches on his arms and back, but nothing life-threatening. As we helped him onto our boat, he came around and grabbed my jacket with both hands. They came out of the fog, he said, his eyes wild. 3 of them, maybe 4. Big as men, but moving like seals. They climbed right over the side and started tearing my boat apart. I tried to fight them off with a gaff hook, but they were too strong. Then one of them spoke. Spoke? Bob leaned forward. What did it say? It didn't speak English, Tom said, but it sounded like it was asking me questions, like it wanted something from me. I looked back at the Times Mary Catherine asterisk. The damage was extensive, but the creatures had left the boat floating and Tom alive. If they'd wanted to kill him, they easily could have. Instead, they'd searched his boat and then left. What were you fishing for, Tom? I asked. King crab. Same runs I've worked for 15 years. Nothing unusual. He paused, looking confused. But they seemed most interested in my nets. They tore them apart, but carefully, like they were looking at how they worked. Bob and I exchanged glances. The creatures were studying human fishing methods. They were learning about us. As we headed back toward Bartlett Cove with Tom aboard, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The water around us was too quiet. No seabirds, no jumping fish, no whale spouts in the distance. Even the wind had died to nothing. It felt like the whole bay was holding its breath. That's when I heard my sister's voice calling from the water. Maria, Maria, help me. Elena had been dead for 3 years, drowned when our fishing boat capsized in a storm near Ketchikan. But I'd know her voice anywhere, and it was coming from somewhere off our port side. Did you hear that? I asked Bob. He looked at me strangely. Hear what? The voice came again, closer this time. Maria, I'm in the water. Why won't you help me? I was already turning the wheel toward the voice when Bob grabbed my arm. Maria, there's nothing out there. Look at your sonar. The water's empty. But I could hear her so clearly, calling for help, begging me to save her. My hands were shaking as I fought the urge to dive overboard and swim toward my dead sister's voice. That's when I understood what these creatures really were, and why the old Tlingit fishermen had warned about them for generations. They weren't just intelligent marine animals, they were something far more dangerous. They were Kushtaka, the shape-shifting otter men of legend. And they were hunting us. By the time we reached Bartlett Cove, Tom Bradley was coherent enough to give us a detailed account of what had happened. The Coast Guard had arrived and was coordinating a search for the creatures, but I could tell they didn't really believe what they were hearing. How could they? Even I was having trouble accepting what we'd witnessed. Bob and I spent the evening going through his footage and trying to piece together what we knew. The creatures were clearly intelligent, organized, and capable of complex behavior. They'd examined human technology, searched a fishing boat methodically, and somehow produced sounds that mimicked human voices. The Tlingit legends describe exactly this, Bob said, reading from an old ethnography book, Kushtaka. Beings that could shift between otter and human form. They lived in the deep waters and were known for luring people to their deaths by imitating the voices of loved ones. But those are just stories, I said, though I was thinking about my sister's voice calling from the empty water. Are they? Bob showed me a page with traditional Tlingit artwork depicting otter-like beings with human characteristics. The resemblance to what we'd filmed was unmistakable. What if these creatures have been here all along? What if the legends are actually biological fact? The radio interrupted our discussion. All vessels. This is Coast Guard cutter, Times Resolute asterisk. We're conducting a sweep of Johns Hopkins Inlet and require civilian boats to maintain a 5-mile exclusion zone. I looked out the harbor. It was fully dark now, but I could see the searchlights of Coast Guard vessels sweeping the water. They weren't going to find anything. The creatures were too intelligent to be caught by conventional search methods. We need to go back out there, I said. Bob stared at me. Are you insane? We barely survived the last encounter. That's just it. We did survive. They could have killed us easily, but they didn't. They're not random predators. They're territorial guardians protecting something, and we need to figure out what. I grabbed my charts of Glacier Bay and spread them on the table. Look at the pattern. All the encounters have been in specific areas. Johns Hopkins Inlet, Marjorie Glacier, and the deep channels between them. These aren't random hunting grounds. Bob studied the charts. Those are all traditional Tlingit fishing areas. Some of the oldest recorded native settlements were right along this coastline. Exactly. What if the Kushtaka aren't just protecting territory? What if they're protecting sacred sites? The radio crackled again. Coast Guard Station Juneau to Ranger Yukon. Please respond. I picked up the handset. This is Yukon. Maria, this is Commander Walsh. We need you to guide our search teams tomorrow morning. Your knowledge of local waters could be crucial. I looked at Bob. He nodded slowly. We'll be ready, Commander. But I wasn't planning to wait for morning. At 3 a.m., Bob and I slipped out of Bartlett Cove in the Times Raven's Wing Asterisk. I'd loaded emergency flares, survival gear, and Bob's underwater camera equipment. If we were going to make contact with the Kushtaka, it had to be on their terms, not the Coast Guard's. The water was dead calm as we headed toward Johns Hopkins Inlet. No wind, no waves, just an unnatural stillness that made every sound carry for miles. I kept the engine at low throttle, trying not to disturb whatever was out there. We were about 2 miles from the glacier terminus when they found us. The first sign was the water around our boat beginning to glow with phosphorescence, tiny organisms lighting up as something large moved beneath us. Then shapes began rising from the depths, surrounding the Times Raven's Wing Times in a perfect circle. 6 Kushtaka broke the surface simultaneously, their sleek heads emerging from the water like synchronized swimmers. In the moonlight, I could see them clearly for the first time. Their faces were incredibly expressive, showing intelligence and curiosity rather than animal instinct. They floated motionlessly around our boat, studying us. "Turn off the engine," Bob whispered. "Let them approach." I cut the motor, and we drifted in the circle of creatures. One of them, larger than the others and with distinctive scars along its neck, swam closer to the boat. When it was just a few feet away, it began to change. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. The seal-like body elongated, becoming more humanoid. The flippers articulated into something resembling arms. The face became more human while retaining its marine features. Within minutes, we were looking at something that was neither fully seal nor fully human, but something entirely new. The transformed Kushtaka pulled itself partly out of the water, balancing on the side of our boat with impossible grace. This close, I could see that its claws were actually elongated fingers with webbed skin between them. Its eyes were large and dark, filled with an intelligence that was unsettling in its depth. Then it spoke, not in the howling language we'd heard before, but in perfect, unaccented English. "You have come to our waters many times, Maria Yukon. Why do you bring the metal boats that take our fish?" I nearly fell backward into Bob's arms. The creature knew my name. It spoke English, and it was asking me questions about fishing practices. "We're park rangers," I managed to say. "We protect the waters, not exploit them." The Kushtaka tilted its head, considering this. "You protect, but your people come with nets and hooks. They take more than they need. They disturb the feeding grounds of our young." "We regulate the fishing," Bob said, finding his voice. "We set limits, enforce seasons. Your limits mean nothing to us. This is our territory. These have been our hunting grounds since before your glaciers formed." The other Kushtaka had moved closer, forming a tight circle around our boat. I could feel the weight of their attention, the pressure of being evaluated by intelligences we'd never imagined existed. "What do you want from us?" I asked. The lead Kushtaka's expression changed, becoming almost sad. "The old agreements are broken. Your people have forgotten the old ways, the old respect. The traditional fishermen knew to ask permission, to leave offerings, to take only what was needed." "The Tlingit," Bob said suddenly. "You're talking about the Tlingit fishing traditions. The people of the land and sea. They understood that we share these waters. But your new people see only resources to be taken. They do not see us." I thought about the 3 dead fishermen, about Tom Bradley's destroyed nets. The attacks. "You're trying to protect your territory. We take only those who take too much, who fish in our breeding areas during the season of young, who use the forbidden methods that catch our people." The creature paused, and its next words sent chills down my spine. "Your sister understood this. Elena always brought tobacco for the water spirits before she fished." My heart stopped. Elena had done exactly that, an old Tlingit tradition she'd learned from our grandmother. She'd throw pinches of tobacco into the water and say a prayer before setting her nets. I'd always thought it was just superstition. You knew Elena? She fished with respect. When her boat was in trouble, we tried to save her. But the storm was too strong, even for us. The lead kushtaka reached into the water and pulled up something that made me gasp. It was Elena's fishing knife, the one with the carved bone handle that had been my grandfather's, the one that had gone down with her boat 3 years ago. She asked us to give this to you, to tell you she understands why you fear the water now, but she also said to tell you that the water is not your enemy if you approach it with respect. I took the knife with shaking hands. The bone was smooth from years in the water, but the carving was still clear. This was definitely Elena's knife. What do you want us to do? I asked. Make the new agreements. Teach your people the old ways. Respect the boundaries we set. In return, we will protect your boats that fish with honor. The kushtaka began sliding back into the water, their forms shifting back toward their seal-like state. But the leader paused at the surface. The fog comes with morning. Maria Yukon. Your metal boat people will search for us, but they will find only empty water. You must choose. Help us restore the balance, or watch more fishermen die when they violate our territory. Then they were gone, disappearing into the dark water as silently as they'd appeared. Bob and I sat in stunned silence for a long time, listening to the gentle lap of waves against our hull. Finally, he spoke. They're not monsters. They're guardians. They've been protecting these waters for thousands of years. I looked at Elena's knife, still unable to fully believe what had just happened. How do we explain this to anyone? How do we make agreements with beings that aren't supposed to exist? Maybe, Bob said thoughtfully, we don't explain it. Maybe we just start honoring the old fishing traditions again. Make it part of the park regulations. As dawn approached, fog began rolling in from the glacier, thick and impenetrable. By the time the Coast Guard arrived to search for us, visibility was down to 10 feet. They found us anchored safely in the inlet, with nothing unusual to report. Nothing except a deeper understanding of why some waters demand respect. The official report stated that the incidents in Glacier Bay were caused by an aggressive pod of killer whales defending their territory during pupping season. The Coast Guard recommended temporary fishing restrictions in the affected areas, while the whales moved on to other hunting grounds. Dr. Robert Taku's footage was filed as inconclusive due to poor underwater visibility and equipment malfunction. The claw marks on the fishermen were attributed to post-mortem predation by unknown marine scavengers. Tom Bradley's account of being attacked by seal men, was dismissed as trauma-induced hallucination. I never corrected these reports. How could I? Who would believe that an ancient species of shape-shifting marine guardians had made contact with us? Who would accept that the traditional Tlingit legends were biological fact rather than folklore? Instead, I worked within the system to honor the agreement I'd made that night in Johns Hopkins Inlet. Over the following months, I quietly implemented new fishing regulations based on traditional ecological knowledge and historical Tlingit fishing practices. Certain areas were designated as seasonal no-fishing zones. Commercial operations were required to use traditional respect protocols before entering protected waters. Native fishing guides were given preference for permits in sensitive areas. To most people, these looked like reasonable conservation measures designed to protect marine ecosystems. They didn't realize the regulations were actually a peace treaty with beings that had protected these waters for millennia. The changes worked. Fishing incidents in Glacier Bay dropped to near zero. The few violations that occurred were handled by the creatures themselves. Boats found drifting with their nets mysteriously tangled beyond repair, but crews unharmed and unable to explain what had happened. Bob transferred to the University of Alaska to study traditional ecological knowledge systems. His published papers on Tlingit fishing practices became required reading for anyone working in Alaska marine protection. He never mentioned our encounter, but his research helped legitimize the integration of indigenous wisdom into modern conservation. I requested a transfer to Inland Forest Service 6 months later. I couldn't explain it to my supervisors, but I developed what the psychologists called severe aquatic phobia. Even looking at deep water made my hands shake. The sound of waves reminded me of voices, calling from impossible depths. Every time I saw a seal, I wondered if I was really looking at something else wearing a seal's shape. The nightmares didn't help. Dreams of swimming in dark water, of voices that spoke in howling languages, of my sister's face looking up at me from beneath the waves. Dreams of Elena telling me that the water spirits had tried to save her, but she'd been too afraid to trust them. I work fire prevention now, in the interior forests, where the biggest body of water is a mountain lake. It's good work, important work, and it keeps me away from the coast. But sometimes, on still nights when the wind carries the scent of salt water from hundreds of miles away, I remember what it felt like to be evaluated by intelligences older than human civilization. Last summer, I got a letter from Mike Harrison, the captain of the Times Northern Star Asterisk. He'd been guiding tourist boats in Glacier Bay and wanted to thank me for the fishing regulation changes. Marine wildlife sightings were up dramatically, he said. The seals seemed healthier, more active, and more comfortable around respectful human presence. Strangest thing, he wrote. Some of the old Tlingit guides say the water spirits are happy again. Whatever that means, the fishing's been incredible for folks who follow the traditional protocols. It's like the ocean itself is rewarding respect. I kept the letter, along with Elena's fishing knife and a small pouch of tobacco. Traditional protocol says you should make offerings to the water spirits before fishing. I've never had the courage to test whether the Kushtaka would honor our agreement if I return to their waters, but I like knowing the option exists. Bob visits occasionally, usually when he's researching in the interior. We don't talk much about what happened that night, but sometimes he'll mention stories he's heard from coastal fishermen. Stories about helpful seals that guide boats away from dangerous ice. About mysterious voices that warn of approaching storms. About fish that seem to cooperate with respectful fishing practices. They're still out there, he told me last winter. Still protecting, still teaching. The people who listen are learning to fish the old way again. I asked him if he'd ever been tempted to go back to Glacier Bay, to try to make contact again. Every day, he admitted. But I think they've said what they needed to say. Now it's up to us to prove we can honor the agreement. That's the thing about some knowledge. It changes you in ways you can't predict. I used to see Alaska's waters as wilderness to be managed, resources to be protected, ecosystems to be studied. Now I understand that some places have been inhabited and protected by intelligences far older than our own. We're not the first guardians of these waters. We're not even the most qualified. We're just the newest species to be offered partnership in something much larger than ourselves. Sometimes, late at night when I'm watching for forest fires, I think about the Kushtaka swimming in the dark waters of Glacier Bay, still hunting, still protecting, still honoring agreements made with humans who remember how to show respect. I wonder if Elena ever meets them in whatever realm she inhabits now, if she tells them about her sister, who learned to fear water, but finally understood why some fears are actually wisdom. I wonder if other parks, other protected areas, have their own guardians that we've simply never learned to recognize. How many ancient agreements have we broken through ignorance? How many more are waiting to be renewed? The radio crackles with a weather report from the coast. Fog rolling in over Glacier Bay, visibility near zero. Fishing vessels advised to exercise extreme caution in unfamiliar waters. Small craft operators should be prepared for unusual marine wildlife behavior. I smile and return to my fire watch. The forests are quiet tonight, but somewhere 100 miles south, ancient guardians continue their patient protection of waters that have known their presence since before the glaciers first began to melt. And if you ever find yourself fishing in Glacier Bay, remember to bring tobacco for the water spirits. Some traditions exist for reasons our modern world has forgotten, but the old agreements still hold for those wise enough to honor them. The water remembers everything, and it's always watching. My name is Samuel Raven, and I've been a ranger at Denali National Park for 16 years. In that time, I've pulled 847 people off this mountain, some dead, most alive, all changed by what they found up there. I'm 41 years old, and I know every crack and crevice of Ruth Glacier like the lines on my weathered hands. Before the Park Service, I spent 8 years in the Army doing mountain warfare training. Cold doesn't bother me much anymore. Heights don't scare me. I can rappel down a 1,000-foot cliff in a blizzard and still have steady hands for radio work. My grandfather used to tell stories about the mountain being alive, about spirits that lived in the ice. I always thought they were just old stories. I was wrong. The call came in on a Tuesday morning in late June. Perfect climbing weather, clear skies, light winds, temperature holding steady at -10 at the 14,000-foot mark. Elite climbing team from Seattle had been radio silent for 18 hours. Their names were Marcus Chen, Sarah Williams, and David Rodriguez. All experienced climbers, all carrying emergency beacons, all gone. I was finishing my coffee when dispatch crackled over the radio. "Sam, we need you on Ruth Glacier. High-altitude rescue." "What's the situation?" I asked, already reaching for my gear. Team of 3 missed their check-in. Last known position was 17,000 feet, technical approach. I frowned. 17,000 feet on Ruth Glacier meant serious climbing. Ice walls, hidden crevasses, places where one wrong step meant 1,000-foot fall into nothing. But these weren't weekend hikers. Marcus Chen had summited Everest twice. Sarah Williams held speed records on McKinley's West Buttress route. David Rodriguez was a rescue specialist himself, worked out of Colorado. Weather report? Clear for the next 6 hours. After that, storm system moving in from the west. 6 hours. Enough time to get up there and back, if everything went right. In 16 years of mountain rescue, I've learned that things rarely go right. I loaded my pack with the usual gear: ropes, ice axes, medical supplies, emergency shelter, added extra batteries for the radio and GPS. The helicopter would take me as far as base camp at 10,000 feet. From there, it was boots and determination. My partner Janet Northwind met me at the helicopter pad. She's been doing this almost as long as I have, and she's one of the few people I trust completely on the mountain. Half Inupiat, half Irish. All business when it comes to getting people home safe. "Any word from the missing team?" she asked as we loaded gear. "Nothing since yesterday afternoon. Could be equipment failure." "Could be," she said, but her tone suggested she didn't believe it any more than I did. The helicopter ride took 40 minutes, weaving between peaks that scraped the belly of low clouds. Below us, the glacier spread out like a frozen highway, marked with the dark lines of crevasses. I'd made this trip hundreds of times, but the view still impressed me. Denali rose ahead of us like a white cathedral, its summit hidden in cloud. We landed at base camp in a whirlwind of snow and engine noise. The pilot looked nervous. "You've got 5 hours before I have to bug out," he shouted over the rotors. "Storm's coming in faster than predicted." I nodded and grabbed my pack. Janet was already checking the GPS coordinates for the missing team's last known position. The reading made me pause. "That can't be right," I said, looking at the display. "That's what I thought too. According to this, they were climbing a vertical ice wall that doesn't exist." I pulled out my paper map, the one I'd been using for 16 years. The coordinates put the missing team somewhere in empty air, 500 feet to the left of any climbing route. "Equipment malfunction," I said, but the words felt wrong in my mouth. We started climbing. The first 2 hours went smoothly. We followed the established route, using fixed ropes where other climbers had left them. The weather held clear skies, minimal wind. Perfect conditions for a rescue. It was Janet who found the first piece of evidence. "Sam," she called from about 50 feet ahead. "You need to see this." She was standing at the edge of a crevasse, staring down into the blue-white depths. I climbed up to her position and looked where she pointed. 30 feet down, embedded in the solid ice wall of the crevasse, was a climbing axe. Not dropped or fallen, embedded, like someone had swung it with incredible force and left it there. The metal gleamed in the filtered light. "That's impossible," I said. "Yeah, but there it is." I rappelled down to get a closer look. The axe was driven into the ice up to its handle. I recognized the brand Black Diamond, same as I carried. I tried to pull it free. It didn't budge. I put my full weight on it, used my own axe for leverage. Nothing. The ice around it wasn't cracked or damaged. It was like the axe had grown there, part of the mountain itself. "Sam," Janet's voice came from above, tight with something I'd never heard before. Fear. I looked up. She was pointing at something beyond the crevasse. "What is it?" "Tracks," she said. I climbed back up as fast as my gear would allow. Janet led me around the crevasse to a patch of snow that had been protected from wind. In the snow were footprints. Human footprints. Size 11 boots, same as thousands of climbers wore. But these prints were wrong. They were spaced too far apart, like someone with legs twice as long as normal. And they led straight up a vertical ice wall that no human could climb. I knelt down and put my gloved hand next to one of the prints. My hand, large for a man my size, covered maybe half of it. "Equipment malfunction on the GPS," I said, but my voice sounded hollow even to me. Janet was scanning the area with binoculars. "Sam, look at this." She handed me the binoculars and pointed up the ice wall. At first, I saw nothing but blue ice and white snow. Then my eyes adjusted, and I saw them. More prints. 50 feet up an impossible vertical surface, clear as if they'd been made in wet concrete. They continued upward until they disappeared in shadow. "We need to follow them," Janet said. "That's a technical climb. We need to follow them," she repeated. I looked at my watch. 3 hours until pickup. 3 hours to find 3 missing climbers on a mountain that suddenly felt like it was playing by different rules. "All right," I said, "but we stick together, and if anything feels wrong, anything at all, we turn around." We started up the ice wall. The climb should have been impossible with our equipment. Janet and I were good, but the route we were following required technical gear we didn't have. Ice walls that steep needed specialized anchors, multiple protection points, hours of careful route planning, but somehow we found handholds where there shouldn't have been any. Ledges appeared just when we needed them. It was like the mountain was helping us, guiding us upward along the same path those impossible footprints had taken. "This doesn't feel right," Janet said during our first rest stop. We were hanging from ice screws about 200 feet up the wall, our feet dangling over nothing. "Define right," I said, though I knew what she meant. The climbing was too easy. The route too perfect, like someone or something had carved it specifically for us to follow. "I mean the mountain, it's helping us." I wanted to argue, but she was correct. In 16 years of rescue work, I'd never encountered a route like this. Every ledge was exactly where we needed it. Every crack in the ice was perfectly sized for our gear. "Maybe we're just getting lucky," I said. "You believe that?" I didn't answer because I didn't believe it. Mountains don't help people. Mountains kill people who make mistakes. But this mountain seemed to want us to follow those tracks. We climbed for another hour. The prints continued above us, always just visible enough to show us the way. They were getting fresher too, the edges sharper, the depth more pronounced. Whatever made them had passed this way recently. "Radio check," I called when we stopped at the next ledge. Static. Nothing but static. "Base camp, this is Raven. Do you copy?" More static. I checked the radio. Full power, antenna extended properly, but we were in a dead zone, cut off from the world below. "Equipment malfunction," I said, but the words were becoming a joke. Too many malfunctions. Too many impossible things. Janet was studying the wall above us with her binoculars. "Sam, I'm seeing something." I looked where she pointed. About 100 feet up, the ice wall curved inward, creating a natural amphitheater. And in that amphitheater, something was moving. "Climbers?" I asked. "Maybe. Hard to tell." We continued up. The movement became clearer as we got closer. 3 figures in bright climbing gear, sitting in the ice amphitheater like they were having a picnic. "Marcus, Sarah, David," I called. No response. The figures didn't move. "They might be hypothermic," Janet said, non-responsive. We reached the amphitheater 20 minutes later. What we found there changed everything. The 3 climbers were sitting exactly as we'd seen them from below. But they weren't hypothermic. They weren't injured. They weren't even cold. They were completely, impossibly frozen. Not frozen like people who die of exposure. Frozen like they'd been dipped in liquid nitrogen. Their skin had the blue-white color of deep ice. Their eyes were open, but clouded over like frozen windows. When I touched Marcus Chen's arm, it felt like touching solid rock. "This is impossible," Janet whispered. I checked David Rodriguez's watch. It was still running. The digital display showed 3:47 p.m. I looked at my own watch, 3:47 p.m. His watch hadn't stopped. Time hadn't stopped. But somehow, 3 experienced climbers had been flash frozen while sitting calmly in a natural ice cave. "We need to get them down," I said, though I had no idea how. "Sam." Janet's voice was very quiet. "Look at their gear." I looked. Their climbing equipment was scattered around the amphitheater, but not like it had been dropped or abandoned. It was arranged, laid out in precise patterns, like someone had been organizing it, or displaying it. "Who would do this?" I asked. Maybe the question is, what would do this? I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the altitude. "Equipment malfunction," I said automatically. Stop saying that. Medical emergency. Altitude sickness. Sudden weather change. Sam, stop. I kept talking because the alternative was accepting what I was seeing. 3 people flash frozen at an altitude where flash freezing was impossible. Gear arranged by unknown hands. Tracks leading up impossible walls. Avalanche. Hidden gas pocket. Volcanic activity. Sam. Janet grabbed my shoulders and made me look at her. Her eyes were wide, but not with fear. With certainty. This isn't natural, she said, and you know it. I wanted to argue. I wanted to keep listing rational explanations. But standing in that ice amphitheater, looking at 3 people who had been turned into statues, I couldn't make the words come. We need to call this in, I said finally. Radio's dead. We need to get back to base camp. And tell them what? That we found 3 climbers who got turned into ice sculptures? She was right. No one would believe us. Hell, I barely believed it myself, and I was looking right at it. That's when we heard the sound. It came from above us, from somewhere higher up the mountain. A low rumbling, like an avalanche starting, but there was no snow falling, no ice cracking, just that deep, rhythmic rumbling, like breathing. We need to go, Janet said, right now. I looked back at the 3 frozen climbers. Standard rescue protocol said we couldn't leave them. Dead or alive, we had to bring them home. The rumbling came again, closer this time. We'll come back with a full team, I said. Specialized equipment. Will we? I didn't answer because I wasn't sure. The mountain that had guided us up here might not let us return. The thing that had frozen 3 experienced climbers might decide we'd seen enough. We started down the wall as fast as safety allowed. Behind us, the rumbling continued, following us like a predator tracking wounded prey. The descent that should have taken 2 hours took 40 minutes. We rappelled recklessly, trusting our equipment and our experience and the growing certainty that staying on the mountain after dark would be a fatal mistake. The helicopter was waiting when we reached base camp, rotors already spinning. Where are the missing climbers? The pilot shouted. I looked back up the mountain. In the gathering dusk, the ice walls looked like the ribs of some massive sleeping creature. Equipment malfunction, I said. But this time, I knew I was lying. The official report said the missing climbers had been caught in an unexpected avalanche. Equipment malfunction prevented radio communication. Bodies unrecoverable due to dangerous conditions and incoming weather. Textbook mountain tragedy. I typed every word of that lie. For 3 days, I tried to convince myself it was true. 3 days of normal ranger duties, normal rescues, normal mountain problems. I answered tourist questions about bear safety and trail conditions. I helped lost hikers find their way back to marked paths. I pretended everything was normal. On the 4th day, another climbing team went missing. This time it was a group of 5. 2 couples from Colorado and a solo climber from Alaska. All experienced. All carrying emergency beacons. All last seen heading for the same area where we'd found the frozen climbers. I'll take this one, I told my supervisor. You sure? You just came off a tough rescue. I'm sure. What I didn't tell him was that I'd been having dreams. Dreams of ice blue eyes watching me from impossible heights. Dreams of footsteps following me through empty hallways. Dreams of a voice calling my name in a language I didn't understand but somehow recognized. My grandfather's language. Athabascan words I'd heard as a child but never learned to speak. Janet met me at the helicopter pad. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. You've been having the dreams too, I said. Every night since we came down. Sam, I think we saw something we weren't supposed to see. Equipment malfunction, I said, but the words had lost all meaning. My grandmother used to tell stories, Janet said as we loaded gear. Old stories about the mountain spirits. Things that lived in the ice before humans came here. Folk tales. Maybe. Or maybe our grandmothers knew things we forgot. The helicopter ride felt different this time. The mountain looked darker, more threatening. Clouds clung to the peaks like smoke, even though the weather report called for clear skies. We landed at base camp and immediately saw signs of trouble. The second climbing team's camp was still there. But it was wrong. Tents were arranged in a perfect circle, something no experienced climber would do. You camp for wind protection and avalanche safety, not for geometry. Their supplies were laid out between the tents in neat rows. Freeze-dried meals, fuel canisters, spare batteries, all organized like a military inspection. like the gear arrangements we'd found with the frozen climbers. "Nobody camps like this," Janet said. I knelt next to one of the tents and unzipped the door. Sleeping bags were laid out perfectly, as if someone had been expecting guests. Personal items were arranged on small camp tables in order of size. "Sam." Janet was standing at the edge of camp, staring at the ground. More tracks. These prints were different, larger. The spacing between steps was wider, like whatever made them had grown since our last encounter. They led away from camp toward a section of the glacier I'd never explored. "We follow them," Janet said. "Maybe we should call for backup. Who would believe us? And what would we tell them?" She was right again. We couldn't explain what we'd seen without sounding crazy. And looking at the perfectly arranged camp, I was starting to doubt my own sanity anyway. We followed the tracks across the glacier. The prints led us through a maze of ice formations that shouldn't have existed. Towering spires of blue ice twisted into impossible shapes. Natural arches that looked like they'd been carved by an artist who understood geometry better than physics. "This wasn't here before," I said. "I know. Ice formations don't appear overnight." "I know. But they had appeared. Sometime in the 3 days since our last visit, this section of the glacier had been transformed into something that belonged in an art museum, not a national park." The tracks continued through the ice maze, always visible, always leading us deeper into formations that made no sense. We walked for an hour through corridors of ice that sparkled with their own light, following footprints that belonged to something that wasn't quite human. That's when we found the first body. Robert Martinez, solo climber from Anchorage. He was standing upright in an alcove of blue ice, perfectly preserved, eyes open and staring. But unlike the frozen climbers we'd found before, Robert was arranged like he was part of a display. His arms were positioned at his sides. His head was tilted slightly upward, like he was looking at something wonderful. His expression was peaceful, almost happy. "He doesn't look scared," Janet whispered. She was right. Robert Martinez looked like a man who had seen something amazing just before he died. His face had the expression of someone watching a beautiful sunset or hearing perfect music. "What could do this?" I asked. "I don't know. But I think it wants us to see." We found the other 4 climbers in similar alcoves throughout the ice maze. Each one perfectly preserved, each one positioned like they were part of a sculpture garden. The 2 couples were arranged so they appeared to be holding hands, frozen in eternal embraces. All of them had the same peaceful expression. All of them looked like they had died happy. "This is impossible," I said. "You keep saying that, but here we are." Janet was right. We were standing in a gallery of frozen people who looked like they'd been preserved by an artist who understood human emotion better than human biology. And the tracks continued deeper into the maze. "We should go back," I said. "We should follow the tracks." "Janet, this thing, whatever it is, it's collecting people." "I know. It might collect us too." "I know." But she was already walking deeper into the maze, following prints that were getting larger and more defined with each step. I had no choice but to follow. The ice corridors opened into a vast natural cathedral. The ceiling disappeared into blue shadows above us. The walls were covered with more alcoves, more preserved climbers, dozens of them stretching back into the ice. And in the center of the cathedral, something was waiting for us. I saw it in glimpses at first. A shape moving between the ice formations, always just beyond clear vision, massive but graceful, covered in white fur that blended with the snow and ice. "Don't run," Janet whispered. "I don't think it wants to hurt us." "How do you know?" Well, once eat the 2. Because we're still alive." The shape moved closer, and I got my first clear look at what had been haunting my dreams. It was 15 feet tall, covered in ice blue fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its arms were longer than human proportions, ending in hands that could have wrapped around my entire torso. Its face was almost human, but not quite too intelligent, too knowing, too ancient. And its eyes were the color of deep glacier ice, and when it looked at me, I felt like it was reading every thought I'd ever had. "Grandfather," I whispered in English. The creature tilted its massive head, and I heard a sound like wind through ice caves. It was laughing. The creature moved with impossible grace for something so large. It walked between the ice alcoves like a curator in a museum, occasionally touching the preserved climbers with something that looked almost like affection. "It's not killing them," Janet whispered. It's keeping them. The creature heard her and turned in our direction. When it spoke, the words came in my grandfather's language, but somehow I understood them. Asterisk, the mountain chooses who stays and who goes. You were brought here to understand. Asterisk. Understand what? I asked, surprised that I was able to speak at all. The creature gestured to the preserved climbers. Asterisk. Your people come to the sacred mountain without permission. Without respect, they bring noise and waste and carelessness. Asterisk. I looked around the ice cathedral. The climbers weren't just preserved, they were displayed, arranged so they could see each other, positioned like they were part of a community. You're protecting the mountain, I said. Asterisk. I am the mountain. I am what your grandfather called Yenold Lushi, the one who walks between the ice and the sky. Asterisk. Janet stepped closer to me. What does it want? Asterisk. I want you to remember. Asterisk. The creature said. Asterisk. I want you to tell the others. The mountain is not a place for conquest. It is not a challenge to be overcome. It is a living thing that deserves respect. Asterisk. The people you've taken, I said. The climbers. Are they dead? The creature's ice-blue eyes seemed to see straight through me. Asterisk. They are between life and death, between the world above and the world below. They are safe here. They are part of the mountain now. Asterisk. I thought about Robert Martinez's peaceful expression, the way the couples looked like they were embracing by choice rather than force. You give them a choice, I said. Asterisk. I show them what they came looking for. The real mountain, not the thing they thought they were climbing. Some choose to stay. Some choose to return to their small lives below. Asterisk. And if we choose to leave? Asterisk. Then you leave. But you carry the mountain with you. You remember what you have seen. You make sure others remember too. Asterisk. The creature moved closer, its massive form casting shadows that seemed to dance in the blue light of the ice cave. Asterisk. Your people have forgotten the old agreements. They have forgotten that some places are sacred. They treat the mountain like it belongs to them. Asterisk. I felt the weight of 16 years of rescue work, 16 years of pulling careless climbers off routes they had no business attempting. You want us to be gatekeepers? Janet said. Asterisk. I want you to be teachers. I want you to help your people understand the difference between adventure and respect. Asterisk. The creature reached into one of the ice alcoves and touched the forehead of a preserved climber. The man's eyes fluttered, and color returned to his skin. Paul? The man said, looking around in confusion. Where am I? Asterisk. You are leaving the mountain. Asterisk. The creature said gently. Asterisk. You have seen what you came to see. Asterisk. The climber Paul looked around the ice cathedral with wonder rather than fear. It was beautiful, he said. I understand now. Asterisk. You will remember. Asterisk. The creature said. Asterisk. You will help others remember. Asterisk. Paul nodded and walked toward the entrance of the cathedral. His movements were calm, purposeful. He looked like a man who had found answers to questions he'd been carrying his entire life. He's not afraid, I said. Asterisk. Why should he fear truth? Why should he fear the mountain's real nature? Asterisk. I looked at the other preserved climbers. Will you release all of them? Asterisk. Those who are ready to remember. Those who can carry the mountain's teachings back to your people. Asterisk. And the ones who aren't ready? The creature's expression was unreadable. Asterisk. They stay until they are ready, or until the mountain decides they have learned enough. Asterisk. I thought about the official reports I would have to file. Missing climbers, equipment malfunctions, weather-related incidents, all lies that protected a truth no one would believe. What if we can't convince people? Janet asked. What if they keep coming to the mountain without respect? Asterisk. Then the mountain will continue to teach them, but it would prefer to have willing students rather than surprised ones. Asterisk. The creature gestured toward the cathedral entrance. Asterisk. You came here following tracks. You came here to rescue the lost, but you found something else. Asterisk. We found the truth, I said. Asterisk. You found one truth. There are others. Your people think they understand nature, but they only understand the surfaces of things. They think strength means conquest, but real strength means partnership. Asterisk. I felt something shifting in my chest, like a door opening that had been locked for years. My grandfather tried to tell me these things. Asterisk. Your grandfather knew the mountain. He walked here before your people brought their noisy machines and their metal stakes. He understood the old agreements. Asterisk. What agreements? Asterisk. Respect for respect. Life for life. The understanding that some things are bigger than human desires. Asterisk. The creature began to move toward the cathedral entrance, and we followed. As we walked, more of the preserved climbers began to stir, color returning to their faces, breath steaming in the cold air. They're all coming back, Janet said. All who are ready. They will return to their lives with new understanding. They will climb differently, or perhaps not climb at all. They will know the mountain as a teacher rather than a trophy. We emerged from the ice cathedral into afternoon sunlight. The temperature felt warmer, the air less thin. The impossible ice formations were gone, replaced by normal glacier topography. Was any of it real? I asked. All of it was real. Reality is larger than what your people usually see. The creature began to fade, becoming translucent against the snow and ice, but its voice remained clear. Remember what you have seen. Teach what you have learned. The mountain is watching to see if your people can grow wise enough to deserve its gifts. And then it was gone. The other climbers found their way back to base camp over the next few hours. They arrived in small groups, quiet and thoughtful, carrying stories they couldn't quite explain. Paul Martinez spoke about feeling connected to the mountain in a way he'd never experienced. The Colorado couples talked about understanding their own insignificance and finding peace in it. None of them could remember exactly how they'd been separated from their gear or why they'd wandered so far off route. But they all agreed on one thing. They had experienced something transformative. Equipment malfunction, I wrote in my official report. Climbers suffered temporary disorientation due to altitude effects and extreme cold. All recovered safely, with no long-term injuries. But the lies were getting harder to type. 3 weeks later, I was transferred to a desk job in Anchorage. Administrative duties, they said. Time to let someone younger handle the high-altitude rescues. Janet was reassigned to a different section of the park. We met for coffee on my last day in Denali. Do you think we did the right thing? She asked. I don't know. I've been thinking about my grandfather's stories, about the old agreements, and I think maybe those stories weren't just entertainment. I think they were instructions. Janet stirred her coffee thoughtfully. I've been reading about indigenous mountain traditions, rituals for asking permission, ceremonies for showing respect. And I think we've forgotten how to be good guests. I'd been having the same thoughts. 16 years of rescues, and most of them involved people who treated the mountain like gym equipment they had a right to use. People who never asked permission, never showed gratitude, never considered that they might be walking on something sacred. What do we do with what we know? Janet asked. I've been thinking about that too. 2 months later, I started a non-profit organization called Traditional Mountain Access. We offer courses in indigenous climbing practices, respect protocols for sacred sites, and what we call mindful mountaineering. The classes are small, but the people who take them are different afterward. They climb differently. They approach the mountain like they're visiting a wise elder rather than conquering an enemy. Janet runs similar programs in other parts of Alaska. We don't talk directly about what we saw on the glacier, but we teach the lessons we learned there. Respect for respect, life for life, partnership instead of conquest. The climbing accident reports from Denali have dropped significantly in the past year. Fewer equipment malfunctions, fewer missing climbers, fewer weather-related incidents. The mountain seems calmer somehow. Last month, I received a letter from Paul Martinez. He's given up technical climbing and started leading meditation retreats in the wilderness. I can't explain what happened up there, he wrote. But I know I'm a different person because of it. I get similar letters from other climbers we encountered that day. They all speak about feeling changed, about approaching nature with new humility, about understanding their place in something larger than themselves. Sometimes, late at night in my Anchorage apartment, I dream about the ice cathedral. In the dreams, the creature is still there, still watching, still waiting to see if we've learned enough to be worthy partners. I think we're getting there. The mountain tracks I see in satellite photos suggest new formations appearing and disappearing on the glacier. natural ice sculptures that last for days or weeks before melting back into ordinary terrain. Art lessons from a teacher 15 feet tall and covered in ice blue fur. Last week, I received authorization to establish a new program. Cultural respect training for all Denali climbing permits. Mandatory education about indigenous traditions and sacred site protocols. It's a small step, but it's a beginning. The mountain is still there, still watching, still teaching. And now we're starting to listen. My grandfather would be proud. The shadow of Mount McKinley isn't a threat anymore. It's a reminder that some things are bigger than human ambition, and that the greatest adventures come not from conquering nature, but from learning to be worthy of its trust. In the Athabascan tradition, every mountain has a spirit. Every glacier has a consciousness. Every peak has lessons to teach those wise enough to listen. I finally understand what my grandfather was trying to tell me. The mountain chooses who stays and who goes. But more importantly, it chooses who learns and who remains ignorant. I choose to learn. Asterisk. The mountain is still teaching for those ready to listen. Asterisk.